all the people that have gone out there against the mainstream media and said, you're going to call us racist, you're going to call us potential Timothy McVeighs, fuck you. War.
Quite sure he's right. Obsessionally neurotic. Pretty dangerous, in fact.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories.
Do you mean you doubt your powers to convince him?
Say it! Say it!
All right, I'll say it.
Worse than that. What I'm afraid of is his power to convince me.
We're talking about putting a manifestly irresponsible man on national television.
Sweetheart, be reasonable.
War.
This is the end game.
All right, everybody. It is Wednesday, April 9th, 2025, the 80th day of the golden age. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. Welcome to the Wednesday subscriber stream, evening edition. This is one of those days where so many things have happened. It actually gets difficult to put a show together because it's like, what's important? How am I going to figure this out? What does it all mean? And then at some point during the afternoon, as just wave after wave of good stuff was happening, I was thinking about some of the clips. You know, Carly Bonet, Midnight Rider, always posts clips from Morning Joe. And it's funny because they have a meltdown every morning about how awful Donald Trump is. It's a show where for 4 hours, they try to make all of their bewildered uniparty left standard issue villagers and child brains hate Donald Trump rather than the Orwellian 2 minutes hate. It's 4 hours hate for Donald Trump. Nothing he does is good. Everything is about to destroy the country. It's about to hurt women and old people and black people and Muslims and transsexuals, and everybody's going to die. That's how they start every single day. And they've usually found something to argue that that's like the evidence that proves Donald Trump is the worst and everything's going to come crashing down around him. And they've done that every day this week. And then throughout the day, things become really, really good. And it feels, and this is funny because in a second, I'm going to show you Alyssa Slotkin, the Democrat congressman or congresswoman, I should say, who did the response to the speech before the joint session of Congress. Actually, let's just go ahead and play the clip. Maybe that'll be the easiest way to approach this.
Is people have no sense of certainty. They cannot plan. They cannot make decisions. They cannot decide whether to invest in opening another factory or not, to move forward, to move backwards. It's the same level of uncertainty I felt 5 years ago during COVID.
The same level of uncertainty I felt 5 years ago during COVID. And isn't that incredible? So one of the earliest insights I had once I started doing this show that like really flipped a switch in my mind was during the beginning of the very deadly pandemic, when it became clear to me that the media, everything they were talking about was always filtered through the lens of how can we frame this thing to hurt Donald Trump the most and make his supporters abandon him. And that's what I see all the time now. The funniest thing, though, is that we have all of these ups and downs throughout the day, and it's become so readily transparent that none of these people, or readily apparent, I should say, that none of these people have any idea of what they're talking about. The experts come on TV and talk about how bad it's going to be. And it's not just Mika and Joe. I mean, they're clowns. They read scripts on television. But then they have the experts and the economists come on, and they don't know what they're talking about. And then all the experts and the rich people and the finance bros and the tech bros and all of the influencer bros that talk about how they have high IQs, they come on and try to show everybody how they're smarter than Donald Trump, and they get proven wrong. And all these people who are just out there yapping all day, always weighing in on everything, got to have something to say about every single thing. They're just face planting nonstop. And that's just a factor of how unstable things are and how they're constantly in motion. But I think for a lot of us, we've been dealing with that for a long time, the uncertainty. And it's, I don't know, comforting in some way to kind of sit back and be like, all right, well, we've seen a lot of uncertainty before. We've seen attack after attack against Donald Trump, and then things will flow in one direction for a little while. And if you wait half a day or 2 days, they immediately boomerang, or within a very brief period of time, I should say, boomerang back on the people doing the attacking. And I think that's what we're dealing with. And on some level, we have to understand that paradigms are shifting right now. I talked about it a little bit the other day in terms of the understanding of how trade has always worked. The understanding from economists, from markets, from, hedge fund managers, whoever it is, they have spent their lives analyzing a controlled system as if the controlled system and the results and what that system produces, as if all of that is happening spontaneously and naturally, minus the control mechanism. They ignore the control mechanism. We're told that it doesn't exist and that you're a conspiracy theorist if you actually believe that there is centralized top-down control over the world's economy. It seems hard for people to imagine that it could be that way. It's too complex. There's too many moving parts. It cannot be that way. But we've talked many times before, people have incentives. As long as you understand those incentives and can map how things are interconnected, all you need are little nudges here and there to keep people in line, advancing toward that same agenda. And so these economists, these finance bros, these hedge fund managers, venture capitalists, et cetera, they will go on the information they're able to take in from that controlled system as though it was natural, as though these things are happening spontaneously. And they believe that the historical trends will then continue into the future. And if that top-down centralized control system begins to collapse or collapses completely, all of a sudden, all the knowledge and the insight and the analysis is meaningless. And I don't think that this is the first time we've observed this phenomenon either. This phenomenon, I should say, or these phenomena. The political analysis of the last 4.5 years that imagines Joe Biden was actually elected in a real election and properly certified and properly inaugurated and just served 4 years as a real and legitimate president of the United States. Well, when that understanding collapses, that is a foundational understanding. When that collapses, everything that is built on top of it just becomes worthless, totally useless. All that analysis, all of the predictions, all the insight dependent on that piece of foundational knowledge just erodes and evaporates with it. And we haven't reached that stage yet on that issue, but it seems like we are reaching that stage when it comes to global trade. And it's going to be just a learning process, even for the experts at this point. Now, because they understood the system before and maybe some of the weak points, and maybe they had thought about how things might work besides that, while not allowing themselves to believe that the whole picture was wrong or mistaken, maybe they will snap back into formation and understand things quickly. I think that people have the ability to do that. I think on some level, that was what I have attempted to do, however successfully, over the past few years, understanding that I was wrong, not just about the surface level things that just immediately become obviously wrong, but stuff that was much deeper. And you dig down and you got to figure out exactly what that stuff is and was, and then how to reroute. And so I think that there's probably a lot of really smart people out there who will be able to do that when it comes to these issues, but it's still going to be an adjustment period. And as we shift paradigms, people who were not experts, people who do not understand those things with great depth, are able to quickly understand the new system and how that's being implemented and what that means. And so we're going to see a lot of people take the place of those experts. And I'm not suggesting that's going to be me. I'm not going to, I doubt, spend the time trying to figure out world trade, for instance, at a deep sort of expert level. But we can understand the macro, we can understand the big picture and directionally where things are headed. And then as reality emerges, we can map those things onto that direction and onto those trends and onto that end goal, seeing these things as waypoints. Whereas the people who are going to cling to that old model will not have the tools to be able to understand the new paradigm as it shifts. And I think that we're in the middle of one of those shifts. And of course, it can't be anything but chaos. We are right now in the midst of the very same trend. And I'm not going to give Alyssa Slotkin too much credit for probably anything she's ever going to say. But in terms of uncertainty, she's right. It's very much like that COVID period. And we're also in that second phase of the Great Reset. Now, whether or not Donald Trump is initiating that, and I don't think he necessarily is, although he is hijacking it and redirecting it and reordering things, I think a lot of this stuff was going to happen regardless. There had to be these adjustments and this reset. And it's also possible that all of that Great Reset stuff was a fear campaign to get us to resist what Donald Trump is doing when it looks like and mirrors or runs parallel to that Great Reset agenda. So the uncertainty, I think, is going to be with us for a while. And I guess, in terms of like, why am I talking about this at the beginning of the show? Well, it's because a lot of this stuff is really hard to understand. And so at that point, we step back and we observe and we try to think about what this could mean, a number of options potentially, what potentialities we might see in the future, and just try to observe with open eyes, understand as best we can, attempt to map these things onto that big picture. And of course, the big picture, as we've been told many times, is the resetting of global trade. And man, we are just right in the midst of it right now. I think at this point, it is undeniable. All right, so subscriber stream, going to check on the chat real quickly. Barely's talking about Chris Krebs. We're going to get to Chris Krebs. And, Donald Trump, whatever he does throughout the day, he then just walks into the Oval Office and begins signing things. And you have like an entirely new news day in 45 minutes. So that's where we are. Rocks Cry Out gifted 5 subscriptions. Thank you very much for that support. I hope everybody with Rumble Premium in the Rumble chat is doing well. I hope that everyone in the Substack, I'm going to have to take a look at that. Oh yeah, now we're looking at it. I'm checking you out, Substack. Oh, nobody's chatting. Well, hi. Ron in Little Rock is doing well. Well, we're good. Okay. So everybody's good. Let us continue. Okay. So I want to start off with some court stuff. And first we will go to CNBC from yesterday in the afternoon. Judge says White House can't ban Associated Press from the Oval Office or Air Force One because they are the media. And the media is very important. From the article, the court does not order the government to grant the AP permanent access to the Oval Office, the East Room, or any other media event, McFadden wrote in his order. It does not bestow special treatment upon the AP. Indeed, the AP is not necessarily entitled to the first in line every time permanent press pool access it enjoyed under the White House Correspondents Association, the judge wrote. The court simply holds that under the First Amendment, if the government opens its doors to some journalists, be it to the Oval Office, the East Room, or elsewhere, it cannot then shut those doors to other journalists because of their viewpoints. McFadden wrote, the Constitution requires no less. And at first glance, that sounds an awful lot like, well, we should all be allowed in there. But I took a look at the opinion a bit, and here is one section from that opinion. It reads, today the court grants that relief, the relief sought by the AP. But this injunction does not limit the various permissible reasons the government may have for excluding journalists from limited access events. It does not mandate that all eligible journalists, or indeed any journalists at all, be given access to the president or non-public government spaces. It does not prohibit government officials from freely choosing which journalists to sit down with for interviews or which one's questions they answer. And it certainly does not prevent senior officials from publicly expressing their own views, the judge wrote. Also in the opinion, toward the end of the opinion, in the kind of summary there at the end, when they're just really laying it down, they said that they can't bar the Associated Press because similarly situated journalistic institutions were going to be allowed. So if you're going to let ABC News or CBS or CNN have that privilege, well, then Associated Press can't be barred. And the similarly situated, that element seemed particularly subjective. Of course, the court can't say that all journalists everywhere have free and unrestricted access to the White House. That would be ridiculous. We could all go down. Well, you got to get a much better or a much bigger press room if that's going to be the case. So you can't do something that absurd. But they wanted some reason why the Associated Press had to be allowed in. And so when these decisions come down, all I think about is, okay, well, what comes next after that? Will there be appeals? Maybe there will be appeals. We want to get this precedent settled down to a T. We want to know the rules. We want the lines drawn on the field, and then we can go play ball. So we'll see what the next steps are. We also have to think about what would it be like if the parties were reversed. In the fake and illegitimate term of Joe Biden, we had the White House, quote unquote, press office and various elements of our totally illegitimate administrative bureaucratic deep state barring journalists, pushing for the censorship of the American people, including journalists and podcast hosts. So how is it going to look in reverse? Let's continue with the court decisions. Another interesting one at the Supreme Court yesterday. Supreme Court allows Trump administration to resume deportations under Alien Enemies Act. And this is Badlands Media of all places. The Supreme Court on Monday granted the Trump administration's request to resume deportations of migrants it says are affiliated with a Venezuelan gang by invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. In an unsigned order, the justices sided with the Justice Department, which argued that challenges to the removals were filed in the wrong jurisdiction. The court said the detainees who are held in Texas cannot contest their deportations in the District of Columbia. As a result, the government is likely to succeed on the merits of this action, the court wrote. And so that was one of the issues from earlier in these proceedings. And in fact, it was the substance of the dissent in the last stage that these defendants, who are kind of unnamed, they're basically anonymously named, illegal immigrants from Venezuela who are designated as members of Tren de Aragua. There's no real further details than that. Well, they're all located at a detention facility in Texas. And yet the case filed, I believe, by the ACLU and some others, was filed in the district court in Washington, D.C., specifically so they could get the home court of the illegitimate government in the federal city, get Judge Boasberg on it, and then just go to town. We'll close this out because it's a short summary here. The justices specified that migrants subject to the Alien Enemies Act after the ruling must be given notice and an opportunity to seek habeas relief in the correct venue before being removed. And so that was one of the other parts, that because they were designated as alien enemies, they would have to forfeit their habeas rights. So the Supreme Court is upholding that, at least for now. A lower court had temporarily blocked the administration from using the 220-year-old wartime law to carry out removals, but the Supreme Court's decision lifts that stay. The ruling comes as legal battles continue to mount over Trump's second-term policies, with more than 100 lawsuits filed against various parts of his agenda and several disputes already reaching the high court. And we're going to come back to that particular part of the subject in just a second. This is from just this afternoon. Supreme Court says Trump doesn't have to rehire independent labor board members for now. And so, again, that was that last decision. That doesn't end things. It just sends it back down to a lower court and decides on that standing issue that the case was not brought in the proper jurisdiction. Chief Justice Roberts on Wednesday allowed President Donald Trump to temporarily remove 2 board members at quote unquote independent labor agencies while the justices consider whether the president may permanently fire them. So we are still getting this framing from the mainstream media, as one would expect, that these agencies are independent in some way. They are not independent in any way. They are part of the executive branch. Congress designates them as independent and says they have oversight over these executive branch agencies. And the president is then not allowed to remove people or change what the agency does or restrict them from making payments. But that's not a real thing. And eventually we'll get there. The brief order does not necessarily indicate which way the court is leaning in the case. Instead, the procedural move will give the justices a few days to consider written arguments before deciding whether or not to grant Trump's request. We're going to come back to that principle as well. The emergency case follows a decision from an appeals court in Washington that temporarily reinstated Gwynne Wilcox, a member of the National Labor Relations Board, and Kathy Harris, chairwoman of the Merit Systems Protection Board. Roberts ordered the board members to respond to Trump's emergency appeal on April 15th. Though the dispute is technical and involves agencies most Americans are not familiar with, it could have profound implications for Trump's efforts to consolidate power within the executive branch, particularly if the conservative court takes Trump up on his request to hear arguments in the case later this year. So this is Solicitor General John Sauer, the attorney who argues before the Supreme Court on behalf of the administration. He said, or he argued, the president should not be forced to delegate his executive power to agency heads who are demonstrably at odds with the administration's policy objectives for a single day, much less for the months it would take for the courts to resolve this litigation. Of course, that is obviously true and obviously comports with the founders' intent. It's impossible to imagine the Constitution being written as it was with any other intent, binding the hands of the president, putting the president as in a position subservient to agency heads that the president didn't even appoint and that supposedly the president has no oversight over. Makes no sense. The underlying lawsuit raises fundamental questions about the president's authority to remove officials within the executive branch that Congress said could only be dismissed for cause, such as inefficiency or malfeasance, not because the president disagrees with their decisions. The conservative Supreme Court in recent years has moved toward expanding the president's power to control independent agencies. And again, that is an inverted framing from the mainstream media. What the Supreme Court has done is chip away at prior precedent that said somehow that the Congress has the ability to bind the president's hands in all of these different ways, so long as they have set up and then funded and then instructed an independent agency that can only exist as part of the executive branch over which the president has plenary authority. This case raises a constitutional question of profound importance: whether the president can supervise and control agency heads who exercise vast executive power on the president's behalf, or whether Congress may insulate those agency heads from presidential control by preventing the president from removing them at will. The three-judge panel of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals initially ruled for the Trump administration, but the full appeals court voted 7-4 on Monday to wipe out that decision, reinstating the board members. The Supreme Court has repeatedly told the courts of appeals to follow extant Supreme Court precedent unless and until the court itself changes it or overturns it, the D.C. Circuit majority wrote in its ruling Monday, and it seems like we might be headed for the Supreme Court overturning it. The Supreme Court in 1935 ruled that Congress may require presidents to show cause such as malfeasance before dismissing board members overseeing independent agencies. But in recent years, the high court's conservatives have slowly chipped away at the independence of those agencies, giving the president more power to control all agencies that fall within the executive branch. And of course, again, that comports with the Constitution and with the founders' intent. There's no way they would have ever created a president as a sole plenary authority in the executive branch and the commander-in-chief of the military, and then also made him subservient to potential imaginary agency heads that might be set up someday already as a result of congressional overreach that the courts have also upheld. And eventually, you know, as we were talking about a few weeks ago, all of this is going to be stripped back to the point of the actual argument, which is the legitimacy of judicial review and judicial supremacy. And we shall see if all of that is removed. Polymathanon in the chat, $10. Anna Paulina Luna _tick. Oh, lunatic. Got you. Got you. I get it. Very clever. I've not been saying that. You nailed it. Is forming subcommittees on why Eddie Murphy is funny as hell. Good day to you, Chris Paul. And does there need to be a why? I had to get up, flick on the ceiling fan, and now I am right back in a flash. Did it. Got the headphones back on almost just in time, but not quite. Almost nailed it. Hesitated at first. That was the problem. You never hesitate. When you know it's got to be done, you just do it. Sounds like a slogan or something. So, an incredible article while we're on the subject of courts, and then we're going to leave the courts behind, at least in some sense, in the direct sense. The New York Times from yesterday, in Trump cases, Supreme Court retreats from confrontation. And I don't know, I kind of want to go through this whole thing because it's just so interesting. This is Adam Liptak reporting from Washington. He's the New York Times Supreme Court expert. So you're about to get a Supreme Court expert from the regime's mouthpiece and paper of record in the United States. This is as official a case for the regime as can be made, and it is every bit as ridiculous as it would have to be. The court led by Chief Justice John Roberts Jr. over the last 2 decades has not been known for its modesty or caution. Immediately complaining already, the court is too conservative. Its signature move has been bold assertions of power backed by sweeping claims about the meaning of the Constitution. Now, hey, you want to reduce the power of the Supreme Court? I'm on board. It gutted campaign finance laws and the Voting Rights Act, overturned the constitutional right to abortion. There is no constitutional right to abortion. There never was a constitutional right to abortion, Kami. What are you talking about? And did away with affirmative action in higher education and adopted a new interpretation of the Second Amendment that protects an individual's right to own guns. What? The right to bear arms shall not be infringed. None of what he's describing is remotely constitutional. The court did nothing more than its job and did not even rise to the level of doing its job well over the last 2 decades. But go on, Kami. But as the first wave of challenges to President Trump's blitz of executive orders has reached the justices, a very different portrait of the court is emerging. It has issued a series of narrow and legalistic rulings that seem calculated to avoid the larger issues presented by a president rapidly working to expand power and reshape government. On Monday, the court ruled that Venezuelan migrants who challenged the administration's plans to send them to a notorious prison in El Salvador had filed their lawsuits in the wrong court without ruling on the underlying issues. Well, we just went over that. That's their job. If it's filed in the wrong court, then it doesn't have standing and can't be heard by that court. Does he want to overturn the principle of standing? Well, then let's just get rid of all the courts. And again, I'd be down. But you can't get mad that they didn't rule on the merits of the case when they're not allowed to be trying that case. The court ruled that the case was filed in the wrong place, the wrong jurisdiction. The justices' new approach appears to have multiple goals: to stay out of the political fray, to maintain their legitimacy, and perhaps most important, to avoid a showdown with a president who has relentlessly challenged the legitimacy of the courts. And I remember when they stayed out of the political fray in late 2020, or was it early 2021, when they decided that the states of the union don't have standing to contest an obviously fake and stolen election. Mr. Trump, Adam Liptak did not have a problem with that. Mr. Trump, for his part, has called for the impeachment of judges who ruled against him and has suggested on social media that courts are powerless to tell him what to do. He who saves his country does not violate any law, he wrote. And that's true. And if the popular mandate stays with Trump, as it has obviously done, then Trump is the final authority. He is the only one with the obvious and overwhelming mandate in this post-constitutional state we find ourselves in. And again, that's just another one of those examples of a paradigm that has to be shifted. All those people acting as though the Constitution, in the form they've understood it throughout their lives, is even a factor right now, are missing the underlying issue, which is that that Constitution that they've understood to be the Constitution of statutes and regulations and unratified amendments and court precedent that has been the dominant force throughout our lives, that's not active any longer. And we can hope that we are operating on the principles of the original Constitution. And because Trump and his team have to navigate both paths at once, what he's doing will still comport with that constitutional abomination that we've all become accustomed to. But what's going on down at the bottom is not that. Let us continue here with the Times. And I just realized that that was not pulled up. Here we are. The new cases have arrived on what critics call the court's shadow docket, as emergency applications requiring the justices to move very quickly on thin briefs and no oral arguments. The terse orders that follow typically decide whether to pause lower court rulings, themselves preliminary and tentative. It is understandable then that the justices may be reluctant to make grand pronouncements in that setting. Why would they be reluctant to make grand pronouncements? They don't have enough argument to decide whether or not something comports with the clear black letter interpretation of the original Constitution, which is their only job. No, they need to be briefed on all of the statutes and all of the regulations and all of the court precedent that the lawyers, to be honest, are probably just finding by using AI at this point. But those streamlined practices may also suggest that the justices should instead stay out of the way entirely and let appeals proceed in the usual way at a stately pace that would, in the fullness of time, produce lasting decisions. Wow. So that sounds a lot like an argument from Adam Liptak in favor of lawfare. The plan was tie Trump up in the courts, get these nationwide injunctions that will stop the administration from being able to implement its agenda in total violation of the Constitution, obviously. And then they just tie it up in the courts for months, appeals back and forth, arguments back and forth, or years. Maybe this particular issue doesn't come up until the end of the Supreme Court's next cycle in June of 2026. Sounds like that's what they wanted. Well, you can't decide these important issues on this brief timeline with these in the court's shadow docket on these emergency appeals. You can't do that. Of course, they can do that. And the freak out is obvious because the lawfare strategy at this point is obvious. Just wait them out. And that's something we've talked about for a couple of years. The regime's entire strategy would be to wait out the Trump administration. Just figure out a way to get through the next 4 years, replace Trump, whether it's with a Democrat or with someone controllable on the Republican side, J.D. Vance or Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley. Keep the system in place. Keep the election psyop running. Keep the courts as they've always been. And then they just pick up the pieces from whatever Trump broke, as they did in the last 4 years with the administrative state and the elections, et cetera, and the courts, and move on. This is going to prevent them from doing that. And so now we're getting the argument why the Supreme Court shouldn't be allowed to hear these cases and should not be taking them. The risk of error increases, Justice Elena Kagan wrote in a dissent on Friday from an order letting the administration freeze teacher training grants when this court decides cases, as here, with bare bones briefing, no argument, and scarce time for reflection. So the court is more likely to make a mistake, she's saying. There will of course be good faith disagreements about when that is called for, she added. But in my view, nothing about this case demanded our immediate attention. Rather than make new law on our emergency docket, we should have allowed the dispute to proceed in the ordinary way. make new law? What is she talking about? Making new law. The whole point is comparing the issue at hand, the law as it exists and is being argued, to the original Constitution. It's not to make new law. Oh, we've decided it works this way, and now this is how it works. We have made new law. Our Council of Nine has bestowed upon the country new law. Michael Dorff, a law professor at Cornell, said the administration's litigation tactics encouraged petty sticklerism in defending against the multitude of lawsuits challenging Trump administration actions. The Justice Department has frequently made nitpicky and dubious procedural objections. The government says the plaintiffs filed in the wrong district, sought the wrong remedy, or sued the wrong official. Are they not allowed to do that? Is that a bad thing? Is it the wrong thing? Because all I care about is whether or not it's the right or wrong thing. Monday's ruling that Venezuelan migrants should have brought their challenge in Texas rather than Washington, Professor Dorff said, it invites further chicanery from an administration that is acting in bad faith. Well, Kami, how do you know they're acting in bad faith? David Strauss, a law professor at the University of Chicago, said there was something to be said for judicial minimalism. The people who argue for judicial supremacy and constant judicial review, and that whatever the court says goes no matter what, also believe in judicial minimalism? There is a traditional idea that the court should avoid difficult issues if it can, even if that means deciding on highly technical or even questionable legal grounds. He said, citing Justice Louis Brandeis's statement that the most important thing we do is not doing. Justice Brandeis, he did whatever he wanted, didn't he? Wasn't Justice Brandeis playing a major role in, let me just check the machine really quickly. Hold for processing. I have this memory of Brandeis being a key figure in the dealings over the transfer agreement in the 1930s and whether or not there would be Nazi boycotts in America, petitioning President Roosevelt, who was his friend, if I'm not mistaken. And the machine is working slowly, doing one of their very important pro searches. Those always take longer. Just answer me, machine. Louis Brandeis, Woodrow Wilson's administration during World War I, the Havara, which is the transfer agreement, and the Nazi boycott are interconnected topics that span pivotal moments in the 20th century history. So, Brandeis, doing nothing, I don't think, was something that you were too terribly concerned with doing. It was not nothing that you were worried about doing. Chief Justice Roberts, back to the New York Times. Actually, let's go back to Strauss for 1 second. Professor Strauss from Chicago. But the court has done something close to the opposite when it comes to abortion, affirmative action, environmental protection, voting rights, and Trump's immunity from prosecution. So you wonder about the court's sense of where the greater threat to our constitutional system is coming from. They are not supposed to worry about the threats to our constitutional system. They are only supposed to decide the issue at hand relative to the original Constitution and the obvious textual meaning of the Constitution. Chief Justice Roberts is surely balancing a number of factors, including protecting his court's legitimacy and authority, finding consensus where he can, and affirming a robust vision of presidential power that must nonetheless abide by the rule of law. Some of these calculations appeared to be at work last month when the Chief Justice issued a statement reacting to calls from Mr. Trump and others to impeach Judge James E. Boasberg, who was handling the case on the Venezuelan migrants. For more than 2 centuries, the Chief Justice said, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate process exists for that purpose. Appellate review process, I should say. The process has yielded 5 emergency rulings so far. So you can't impeach judges. You just have to go back through the legal system again. So there is no check on the courts. Ultimately, the courts have final say on everything. And if you don't like their final say, well, then you have to go through the appellate process in another route and hope to get something overturned. But then when something does get overturned, as the Dobbs decision did to Roe versus Wade, well, then it's the court doing too much. The court shouldn't do those things. It shouldn't overturn precedent. Do you see the system? The circular action of that system, impenetrable from the outside, undisputable. All of the majority opinions were unsigned, which is routine when the court rules on such applications. But that practice is open to question. While serving on a federal appeals court in 1990, Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died in 2020, wrote that putting a name to an opinion, quote, serves to hold the individual judge accountable and, quote, puts the judge's conscience and reputation on the line. The alternative, Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1822, is certainly convenient for the lazy, the modest, and the incompetent. And all good. Sign them. Put the names on them. Write the opinions. In any event, the 5 orders said very little. One ruled that a challenge to a trial judge's order barring the firing of a government watchdog should be held in abeyance. Another instructed a judge who had told the administration to restore foreign aid to clarify what obligations the government must fulfill. A third, allowing the administration to temporarily freeze teacher training grants, relied on a melange of laws and doctrines. New York Times. It's a melange. The Administrative Procedure Act, sovereign immunity, the Tucker Act, to include that the challengers had most likely sued in the wrong court. Okay, that's pretty convoluted. I'll give it to you. These were, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote in the dissent, ancillary threshold and remedial questions that ducked the real one. Were the administration's actions lawful? So she's upset that they didn't get to decide in the finality of it all, and that the procedural issues were the basis of the decision. And now it has to go back to other courts, not getting the result they had already liked from that perspective. And it's always worth mentioning that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was nominated by a fake and illegitimate president and confirmed by a fake and illegitimate Senate. There were large issues at play in the case of the Venezuelan migrants decided Monday, including the constitutionality and proper interpretation of the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which grants the president authority to detain or deport citizens of enemy nations in times of war, and whether the migrants were in fact members of a gang, the administration contends is covered by the act. And so they want that fact argued out in the courts, whether or not they're actually in that gang. They want the federal government to have to make an evidence-based case and then leave it up to the courts to decide whether or not they are alien enemies, which is not how the law is written. It's certainly not how the Constitution is written, and certainly not what the founders would have intended for the executive, that the courts get to decide whether or not a person from the country designated as the alien enemy is actually an alien enemy. What kind of immigration system would allow that for that? Oh yeah, it's the one that we have now, which is no immigration system, the sort of immigration system that facilitates a global slave trade. That's what we have now. We do not reach those arguments, the majority said, ruling only that the migrants should have sued in Texas rather than Washington. The majority added that the government had to allow the migrants a modicum of process. We just went through that. That was a concrete ruling, and it commanded 9 votes. But Justice Sonia Sotomayor said in dissent that the whole enterprise was nevertheless flawed in light of the administration's efforts to evade judicial review and its apparent disregard of a trial court's order. So the administration is attempting to evade judicial review, which should not exist in the first place and was created by Justice John Marshall in Marbury versus Madison after the founders themselves had argued against it and chosen not to add it into the Constitution just 14 years prior. The government's conduct in this litigation poses an extraordinary threat to the rule of law. That a majority of this court now rewards the government for its behavior with discretionary equitable relief is indefensible. We, as a nation and a court of law, should be better than this. That sounds like panic to me. And Sotomayor and Kagan, having been nominated under Obama's legitimacy as president has to be questionable at best. And we will see how all of that evolves in the future when it comes to his eligibility for office in the first place. And people still think that's crazy and shocking. Well, Kamala, the woman who most people believe actually ran for president last year, is similarly ineligible. Checking the chat briefly. Let's close this New York Times article out. The Fifth Order on Tuesday paused a trial judge's ruling requiring the administration to reinstate fired workers on the ground that the challengers lacked standing to sue. Several of the court's actions have been closely divided, turning on the votes of 2 justices at its ideological center, Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett. The 2 did not outline their thinking in every case. And I know that it is the trendiest thing ever on our side of the football, let's say. And I will allow for the fact that many of the people who are quote unquote on our side of the football are actually just in the normie con thing, the GOP elite, the GOP establishment, Con Inc., etc. That aside, and their hatred for Amy Coney Barrett, every time a decision goes in a way that they think is not their way, and Amy Coney Barrett is siding with the liberals, it's Amy Coney Barrett is the worst person in the world. And maybe that's a very good narrative to run, because on the other side of that are all the child brains and standard issue villagers of the uniparty left thinking that Amy Coney Barrett is like their girl. And that doesn't hurt us for when Amy Coney Barrett decides in a direction that benefits Trump. We have to stop looking at Supreme Court decisions as, are these good for us or good for them? The only standard should be, did they make a proper decision based on the law and the original Constitution? Not did they help us or did they hurt us? That's not what the court is supposed to be. And the more we promote that the court should be that way, the more of that we're going to get. And we should understand that getting that for this long is a big part of the problem. Friday's order on grants to teachers noted that Chief Justice Roberts dissented. He did not provide a reason. Monday's order on the Venezuelan migrants, Justices Kagan and Jackson joined all of Justice Sotomayor's dissent. Justice Barrett, by contrast, joined small slices of it and did not explain why. In her own dissent in the case of the migrants, Justice Jackson said that one of the court's darkest moments, its decision in Korematsu versus the United States, in some ways compared favorably to Monday's ruling. That decision endorsed an executive order that required 110,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry to be removed from their homes and confined in detention camps. The court relied on wartime hysteria streaked with racism, sullying its reputation and damaging the constitutional principles it was meant to uphold. Well, that is certainly an interpretation. Let me just check something with the machine for a minute. I'm checking to see whether they were actually citizens at the time, these 110,000 Japanese. Because if they weren't, then the same problem applies. If Japan is a declared enemy in war, then people, predominantly American citizens, it says, approximately 2/3 of those incarcerated were U.S. citizens by birth, including second and third generation Japanese Americans. Okay, so now there you have a different issue when it comes to those particular 110,000, but that's still an issue worth pursuing when it comes to dual loyalties. And who knows, perhaps the issue of dual loyalties might come up in the future. I don't know if you can hear my dog. All right, dog. In 2018, in upholding President Trump's ban on travel from several predominantly Muslim countries, Chief Justice Roberts addressed the decision in his majority opinion. Korematsu was gravely wrong the day it was decided, he wrote, adding that it has been overruled in the court of history. But Justice Jackson wrote Monday that there was something to be said for how the court had acted in deciding Korematsu as compared to the current moment. At least when the court went off base in the past, it left a record so posterity could see how it went wrong. With more and more of our significant rulings taking place in the shadows of our emergency docket, today's court leaves less and less of a trace. And it is a very interesting dynamic that we are dealing with now when it comes to the courts, understanding the illegitimacy of the government, the illegitimacy of the court system, the fact that we are in a post-constitutional state and should be operating only on the basis of the original Constitution, and then whatever else might be going on behind the scenes. And I think at this point, it's incumbent upon anyone in the truth community to acknowledge that something has been going on behind the scenes for the last 4.5 years. Trump didn't simply walk away and allow Joe Biden to be president of the United States of America and commander-in-chief of the United States military. Even assuming that that's possible at this point is probably a bridge too far. It's a ridiculous notion. And because anyone who has listened to this show for a long time and who has listened to Devolution Power Hour and followed John Harold's work for a long time, and even the vast majority of Q followers, and probably other people in various parts of the truth community who don't ascribe to either of those, probably because they've never actually looked into them, should understand that something else was going on. Executive Order 13961, the devolution executive order in John Harold's interpretation. That was dealt with on the last night of Joe Biden's fake and illegitimate administration. Come on. Something else has been going on. And so when you understand all of those things, and we're watching this court process evolve, should the courts be allowed through that top-down centralized control and orchestration, the system operating as it's operated in the past, should the courts be allowed to tie the administration's hands throughout the entire next 4 years? That's what's really at stake. I would guess that's why these things are being moved so quickly to the Supreme Court. And then I would suspect, to conclude this New York Times article, I would guess that's the reason why this particular issue, this shadow docket process, the emergency appeals to the Supreme Court, are the cause of so much panic. All right. I was just looking in on Substack. It's funny. Some people are, I guess, upset about not being able to see on Rumble. It's right there on Substack. The subscription has a live stream for paid subscribers every Wednesday. And you can see the live stream for paid subscribers on the place where you pay to subscribe. I don't know what's difficult about that. 2 times a month. So, I don't know, unsubscribe. Oh, it's amazing. Let's continue. So I would say that the court is doing an admirable job of disenfranchising itself. And should we be upset about that? I don't think we should be. So while we're on the subject of court decisions, this issue on regulations and the order Trump signed today, which we will go through in just a second, was one of the issues discussed by Trump in the Oval Office today.
There are a large number of regulations on the books. These are regulations that are currently in effect that we believe blatantly violate the law, blatantly violate Supreme Court precedent that otherwise are just blatantly illegal. So what this presidential memorandum does basically just directs the heads of your departments and agencies to follow the law and to cease enforcing regulations that are blatantly illegal or unconstitutional.
It's a big deal. It's really very important that we get these memorialized
Yes, sir.
in Congress. Very important. For the long haul, right?
Yes, sir.
And so let's discuss some of these regulations, because this is basically a cheat sheet to, I believe, the legal strategy that we are going to see pursued in the rest of the Trump term. This is the fact sheet from the order today. President Donald J. Trump directs repeal of regulations that are unlawful under 10 recent Supreme Court decisions. Today, President Donald J. Trump signed a presidential memorandum requiring agencies to rescind regulations that are unlawful under 10 recent landmark Supreme Court decisions. This memorandum implements President Trump's Executive Order 14219, ensuring lawful governance and implementing the President's Department of Government Efficiency Deregulatory Initiative. EO 14219 ordered agencies to review and identify their unlawful regulations. Now, President Trump is directing agencies to prioritize that review under 10 recent watershed Supreme Court cases and to repeal regulations that are unlawful under those cases. Now, I think I've talked a couple of times on the podcast over the past couple of months about Justice Neil Gorsuch's book, Overruled. And Overruled talks at length about all of these regulations that have been created by these agencies. It's essentially Congress establishing these agencies under the executive branch, delegating their authority to these agencies to make law for American people, and American businesses, with no representation for the people whatsoever. And the president has no authority to direct the agencies of the executive branch. So over time, thousands upon thousands of regulations governing the most ridiculous minutia, advantaging one business over another, barring people from doing things they have an obvious human right and constitutional right to do based on the political whims of the administration. But truly, you can see that it's only the whims of the administration when a regime administration is in place, and it's not related to the administration at all when the regime's not in power. So it's really just the uniparty's whims, not even the elected representatives of the people at any point, just the administrative state. They build this entire body of rules and regulations, all of it. I'll be more responsible and not say all of it. A great deal of it is obviously unconstitutional, and it does not comport with these decisions that declare the constitutionality in recent years. And worth noting, some of this was accomplished during that term where the fake and illegitimate president was pretending to be in power. President Trump's memorandum directs departments and agencies to review rules for legality under 10 recent watershed Supreme Court decisions. And again, this is a cheat sheet, so I think it's worth going through these just to put the big picture ideas in our heads so that we can see in the future when issues arise, oh, this relates directly to that case. I remember hearing that in those 10 decisions on which these regulations had to comport, or to which these regulations had to comport. And when, again, last thing to say before we get into these decisions is, if these agencies are responsible in doing all these things, the level of panic and the amount of blowback and the court cases, which are going to be nothing, that is going to be a level of panic I don't think that we've seen before. I could be wrong, but that would be my prediction. And I think that it's going to be extremely entertaining. So the first one, Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo. That's the decision that overturned the Chevron doctrine. Accordingly, the fact sheet reads, agencies are to repeal any regulation that is not consonant with the, quote, single best meaning, end quote, of the statute authorizing it. Agencies are also to repeal any regulation that was promulgated in reliance on the Chevron doctrine and that could be defended only by relying on Chevron deference. That is quite amazing. That's a whole lot of decisions. West Virginia versus EPA was a landmark ruling applying the major questions doctrine, the principle that an agency cannot claim to discover vast delegations of power on an important issue in a statutory text that doesn't clearly provide such authority. Agencies cannot seek to hide elephants in mouse holes, it says. Accordingly, agencies must repeal any regulation promulgated in violation of the major questions doctrine. So these are long-standing Supreme Court precedents on which the agencies were operating. The foundation is being pulled out from under a whole range of agency decisions. And so it is just another massive broadside at the administrative state, and one that will not get enough discussion in the media. I would think, I would really strongly doubt that we're going to hear a lot about this. SEC v. Jarkisi, and we've talked about this a bunch in the last couple of years on the podcast. That decision held that it violates the Seventh Amendment for agencies to adjudicate common law claims in their in-house courts. Agencies accordingly must repeal any regulation authorizing enforcement proceedings that enable the agency's courts to impose judgments or penalties that can only be obtained via jury trial in Article 3 courts. And you have to wonder if some of that is going to be retroactive based on prior agency decisions and agency court decisions, the administrative courts. The agencies are no longer allowed to have their in-house courts so that they can investigate, then prosecute, and then be judge, jury, and executioner. The agencies then take on the power of the Congress to create laws through the rules and regulations, etc., and the power of the judiciary and the power of the executive, because they are able to investigate and prosecute. So they take all of the constitutional powers that were meant to be distributed among three branches and bring them all in-house to these bureaucratic, administrative, deep state agencies. That cannot happen, obviously, in our system. It breaks down the entire system. And now all of that's going to have to go away. So all of the administrative court precedent in these agencies, gone. What about the people who have been prosecuted and punished and penalized as a result of these administrative courts? How many companies have had to pay fines because of what the SEC's administrative courts find? And then what happens? Do they get compensated? Do they get made whole for being victimized by a process that was never constitutional in the first place? It's going to be interesting to see the fallout from that. Michigan v. EPA held that it violates the Administrative Procedure Act for an agency to promulgate regulations without properly considering the cost as well as the benefits. Agencies accordingly must repeal any regulation where the costs imposed are not justified by the public benefits, or where such an analysis was never conducted to begin with. Very interesting. Sackett v. EPA. It's a lot of cases against the EPA. Sackett ended a 20-year attempt by the EPA to enforce the Clean Water Act against landowners whose property was near a ditch that fed into a creek, which fed into a navigable interstate lake. Agencies accordingly must repeal any regulation inconsistent with a properly bounded interpretation of waters of the United States. Trump also signed an order today about maritime activity, and I haven't had a chance to read that one yet. I'm going to go through that, and maybe we'll talk about it on Friday. Ohio v. EPA struck down an EPA plan under the Clean Air Act that the EPA had adopted after the scientific and policy premises undergirding it had been shown to be wrong. Agencies accordingly must repeal any regulation that does not sufficiently account for the costs it imposes, or for which foundational assumptions have changed and are no longer defensible. Cedar Point Nursery v. Hasid held that a law that forced landowners to admit union organizers onto their property violated the takings clause. Agencies accordingly must repeal any regulation inconsistent with a proper understanding of the takings clause, which protects far more than just real estate from being taken by the government without compensation. So an interesting issue of property rights. Students for Fair Admissions v. President and Fellows of Harvard College in 2023 held that affirmative action admission programs violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which shouldn't be considered for anything, by the way. And if that means affirmative action becomes legal again for colleges, I think that that's probably a worthwhile trade-off, because the 14th Amendment is the legal, quote unquote, constitutional basis for the entire abominable anti-constitutional system that we have in place. And that's not, it is my argument now, but that's the argument of Columbia Law School professor George P. Fletcher in his book, Our Secret Constitution. Continuing. Agencies accordingly must repeal any regulation that imposes racially discriminatory rules or preferences. As the court said, eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. Well, good luck, commies. It's awfully hard to institute race quotas or any of the race or gender agendas without obviously discriminating. And when that falls away, Carson v. Macon of 2022 held that a law excluding religious schools from participating in Maine's school voucher program violated the Free Exercise Clause. Agencies accordingly must review their regulations to ensure equal treatment of religious institutions vis-a-vis secular institutions for purposes of funding and access to public benefits. Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn v. Cuomo in 2020 struck down New York's COVID-era occupancy restrictions on churches and synagogues because they were uniquely harsher than those that applied to essential, quote unquote, businesses, such as acupuncture facilities. Each agency should review its regulations to ensure at least equal treatment of religious institutions vis-a-vis secular institutions for regulatory purposes. So to wrap it up, avoiding cumbersome and unnecessary procedures, President Trump's memorandum directs agencies to revoke these unlawful regulations expeditiously, using the Administrative Procedure Act's good cause exception where appropriate. Agencies must move quickly to delete illegal regulations from imposing further burdens on the American people. This, I believe, is going to be an absolute decimation and evisceration of the regulatory regime. That's incredible. And I mean, that, if I'm reading this correctly, and I'm pretty sure I am, that is as big a win as it gets if we are talking about removing the administrative bureaucratic deep state and returning our system of laws and the everyday rules which we are forced to live by. This just tears it down to its core. The agencies have got to be hurting. I mean, the entire system is built on these the agency regulations and the ways these agencies have operated. And when you strike right at the heart of that, as the Trump administration is doing right now, I can only imagine. It's going to be fun to watch. This was the New York Times. Hold on a second here. Let's get this pulled up. Actually, I'm sorry. It's CNN. This is from this morning. Trump is dismantling election security networks. State officials are alarmed. Misha Pride, then mayor of South Portland, Maine, was greeting voters early on Election Day when police cars suddenly swarmed outside the city's community center with lights flashing. Possible shooting, the city manager texted Pride. Officers locked down the center. Authorities quickly determined the call to police was a hoax, one of hundreds of threats and cyber attacks last November aimed at disrupting the presidential election. Some pushed by partisan zealots, others perpetrated by foreign state actors, including Russia and China. Voting at the community center was delayed by only 10 minutes. The attacks in Maine and elsewhere across the U.S. had minimal impact because of strong preparation and quick work by an information sharing and analysis network of hundreds of federal, state, and local election, cybersecurity, and law enforcement officials. But now key parts of this network, much of it built over the past 8 years, are being systematically dismantled by the Trump administration and Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. A CNN investigation has found, leaving election offices across the country scrambling to protect against future threats. In early February, Musk's team laid off 130 staffers at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, including 10 regional security specialists who worked with local and state election officials. The Trump administration is also advancing plans to strip civil service protections from 80% of the remaining CISA workforce, potentially allowing them to be fired for political reasons. Attorney General Pam Bondi that month disbanded a key FBI task force charged with investigating foreign efforts to influence elections. She also left in the wind the fate of another FBI task force that investigated threats against election workers and polling places. And actually they also talk about the letting go of Timothy Hoff. That's a problem for them. And they're talking about Kristi Noem, who's been going directly after immigration issues. And I really do have to wonder when they're talking about South Portland, Maine, whether there is some other operation involved there and why that building would have been targeted. Let me just see if, no, okay. So it's not in the article. Portland, Maine was maybe the primary location discussed in that New York Times article from the summer of, I think it was 2022 or maybe 2023, dealing with the global slave trade and the fact that immigrants were being brought through the southern border by the cartels and then handed off to these NGOs that would then distribute them around the country and direct them to the places they would have jobs waiting for them. Essentially indentured servitude. And they would be staying at properties, apartment buildings, hotels, whatever it was, that were paid for by the regime, by aspects of the regime, the corporate world, etc., creating then company towns and creating immigrant communities, different ones in different cities all around the country. And, of course, a lot of people are familiar with the Somalian community in Minneapolis and Ilhan Omar's direct connection to that, and how she basically directs the immigrant community in Minneapolis, which is intimately involved in issues like voter fraud, etc. All these things work together in that network. And I have to wonder if they were striking directly at that network. But let's leave that aside for now and focus on the CISA part, because Donald Trump had another interesting action today in the White House. And this is a couple minutes long, posted by Rapid Response, the White House kind of social media coordination office for the Trump administration. And so we're going to go over to X, formerly Twitter, for just a couple of minutes here. I think it's about three minutes long. I'm gonna speed it up a bit.
Christopher Krebs, the former head of CISA. This is a man who weaponized his position against free speech in the election context, in the context of COVID-19. The presidential memorandum to the one you just signed, assurances he might have, and further instructs your Department of Justice, other aspects of your government, to investigate some of the malign acts that he participated in while he was still head of CISA.
This is another one. I don't know that I met him. I'm sure I met him, but I didn't know him. And he came out right after the election, which was a rigged election, a badly rigged election. We did phenomenally in that election. Look what happened to our country because of it. Open borders, millions of people coming into our country. Russia and Ukraine, that would have never happened. October 7th would have never happened. Afghanistan, the way that they withdrew, with 13 dead, but so many killed, actually. I mean, so many killed outside of the 13 soldiers, hundreds of people killed. And maybe, I don't know, never mentioned, but I mentioned it, 42 or 43 people so badly injured, the legs, the arms, blown off, the face. And it was all because of an incompetent group of people that preceded us. And that would have never happened. And this guy Krebs was saying, oh, the election was great. It was great. Well, it's been proven that it was not only not great. When you look at all these lawyers and law firms that are signing, giving us hundreds of millions of dollars, it was proven by so many different ways and so many different forms, from the legislatures not approving to the that worked at, from all of the different scamming operations. It was a very corrupt election. They used COVID to cheat. And we're going to find out about this guy, too, because this guy's a wise guy. He said, we proved this is the most secure election in the history of our country. Now, this was a disaster. And frankly, we should go to paper ballots, same-day voting, voter ID. And one other thing, you should get a little certificate that says you're a citizen of our country. You get a citizen piece of paper that says you're a citizen before you can vote. But you want voter ID and you want paper ballots, and you really want same-day voting. If you don't have same-day voting, they decide to change the air conditioner. Oh, we're fixing the air conditioner. Let's move all these boxes. We'll bring them back in a few days, and then they don't bring back those boxes. We got to have safe elections. We have to have borders. Ideally, we have to have a free press, which we don't have. We don't have a free press. We have a very dishonest press. This is an honor. We're going to find out whether or not he was right. This was a disgraceful election, and this guy sat back saying, well, I'm a member, or like he's a Republican or something, and almost right from the beginning. And he's tried to make the case that this election was a safe election. I think he said, this is the safest election we've ever had. And yet, every day you read in the papers about more and more fraud that's discovered. He's the fraud. He's a disgrace. So we'll find out whether or not it was a safe election. And if it wasn't, he's got a big price to pay. And he's a bad guy. There's another one. I have no idea who he is. Krebs. No idea who he is. I'm sure he was in the room at some point, just like you're all in the room, but I have no idea who he was. So thank you very much. Those last two are very important, I think, for the country.
All right. So Chris Krebs in the crosshairs, finally. That is the man who, in the introduction to my show that I've been playing for years, says this was the most secure election. I guess we'll see about that. Donald Trump on the White House. So the order that Donald Trump signed, I should say. Here is the fact sheet for that on whitehouse.gov. Today, Donald Trump signed a presidential memorandum revoking any active security clearance held by Chris Krebs and his associates. The order directs the head of every federal agency to immediately revoke any active security clearance held by Krebs. And funny thing, my friend Garrett Ziegler pointed out today, reminded that Chris Krebs was an environmental science major that ended up running the cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, overseeing an obviously stolen election. And then amusingly, a couple years later in 2022, I think, or maybe 23, CISA released a statement that acknowledged that it was not the most secure election and that the machines, as J. Alex Halderman has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, have all sorts of problems. They also hired a firm, MITRE, to refute J. Alex Halderman's report. They did not do a very good job of that. The order also suspends any active security clearance held by individuals at entities associated with Krebs, including Sentinel-1, pending a review of whether such clearances are consistent with the national interest. And Sentinel-1 sounds familiar, and I wonder if it's beyond just from Krebs. And I'm trying to search quickly in Telegram, and I'm not finding it. I'll have to look up Sentinel-1 later. I feel like I've seen that name recently. But let's continue. Furthermore, the order calls for a review of Krebs' activities as a government employee, including his leadership of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The review will include a comprehensive evaluation of all of CISA's activities over the last 6 years and will identify any instances where Krebs or CISA's conduct appears to be contrary to the administration's commitment to free speech and ending federal censorship, including whether Krebs's conduct was contrary to the suitability standards for federal employees or involved the unauthorized dissemination of classified information. Those are pretty big issues. Federal censorship, the dissemination of classified information. And again, you know, we talk about paradigms. I understand that there are certain ones that, because of the way people form beliefs, are hard to get on board with, because even though I am pretty clear about the fact, as far as I'm concerned, that many of these conclusions about the paradigms, the new paradigms we've moved into, are I believe, the product of logical necessity. Like, it has to be this way, right? Can I prove to you in a legalistic, academic way, in the sort of way that normies on Twitter require, that there was something else going on behind the scenes for the last 4 years of Joe Biden's fake and illegitimate presidency? Well, no, I can't prove to you that way. But I can make a really good argument that I believe is conclusive, and that would suggest that it is a much stronger likelihood that something else was going on behind the scenes than that the normie interpretation is correct in its view of what has been happening over these last few years. Okay. And so if people are going to require the legalistic academic standards, they want something proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, even though the belief they hold now cannot be proven at all and is not the product of logical necessity or even something reasonable that you could believe. It's the product of television interpretations mixed with the way things have always been. If you are able to enter that new paradigm, I understand not everybody is, and I hope that everybody will be at some point, because I think that that's how we actually have to operate in our lives. And I think that that's what it means to have good judgment, is to trust your judgment and your sober, rational evaluation of circumstances, bringing in knowledge from all fields and trying to make sense of it. That's how we should be making decisions, not just accepting the right thing to do from authority, because that's the way it's always been understood throughout our lifetimes. Okay. That is something that we have to get our minds working into once we understand that our reality has been inverted intentionally by the television, by academia, by our government, etc., over decades and decades and decades. All right. And so once we move past that, understanding that certain other things would be going on in the background, and understanding that when we're talking about a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, then what we're talking about is information that leaves a trail and that was probably monitored because something was going on the last few years. Well, then that makes me think, when I see the potential for unauthorized dissemination of classified information or claims toward federal censorship, that these investigations are not just going to begin now that Trump has signed this order. This is the active phase after the investigation and evaluation process that would be the product of monitoring these things throughout the entire last 6 years. Okay. So I cannot imagine the situation where Trump and the people around Trump, and more importantly, the people around Trump, would have just been hands off on this for the entire Biden administration, and now come in at this late stage and been like, man, I hope we can access that information from the last 6 years so we can actually complete these investigations. And if you are still on board with me that far, then the last thing to understand would be that the lack of action against a character like Chris Krebs in 2020 and 2021 and beyond would not be an indication that nothing was being done. And I don't know if this is just a phase in the info op to use Chris Krebs as this character that delivers us this narrative. I guess it's possible. But otherwise, this seems like a pretty direct shot fired at censorship and fake elections, which, as far as I'm concerned, are the two biggest issues that everything else rests on. Back to the fact sheet here. And I hope that makes sense to everybody. By the way, Maureen in the Substack chat said, I lived there, and she means in Portland, Maine. I saw it happen. They overtook all the jobs in the hospitals. And, you know, this is what the immigration program is. It's not people coming to America in search of a better life, just them picking up, leaving these terrible conditions behind, and then on their own coming to America. It is a global slave trade. The UN has programs for global migration. What else could it be? And then they work in concert with the cartels. And then once they cross the border, the NGOs. And then once the NGOs distribute them, the corporations tied in with the global regime. It is a system that works together to produce slave labor in the United States. And you can see the system producing exactly what it's designed to produce. So to then deny the existence of the system and deny the purpose of the system when you can see what the system produces is madness. And yet we're told we're conspiracy theorists for acknowledging what is the obvious purpose of that system. Crazy town. Let us continue. Krebs, the former head of CISA, is a significant bad faith actor who weaponized and abused his government authority. Krebs, through CISA, suppressed conservative viewpoints under the guise of combating purported misinformation and recruited and coerced major social media platforms to further its partisan mission. This sounds like the connective tissue that will be necessary to finally bring those class action lawsuits against big tech for censorship to their obvious and necessary conclusions. And hopefully those of us who were censored by our governments, and I'm provably censored by the government of California, as we've discussed too many times to rehash. This is the sort of thing that just says, yes, there is proof. This is the government censoring directly. And it seems like the Trump administration is going straight forward on this. Krebs covertly worked to blind the American public to the controversy surrounding Hunter Biden's laptop. He promoted censorship of election information, including known risks associated with certain voting practices. That would be the machines. And of course, mail-in. And falsely and baselessly denied that the 2020 election was rigged and stolen. That is a very bold claim for the White House to be making, including by inappropriately and categorically dismissing widespread election malfeasance and serious vulnerabilities with voting machines, and he did that in Senate testimony. He also skewed the bona fide debate about COVID-19 by attempting to discredit widely shared views that ran contrary to CISA's favored perspective. Trump has made clear that loyalty to the United States must come before personal or partisan agendas, taking decisive action against those who misuse their undeserved influence to deceive the American public. And you know what? I think I might have, oh no. While we're on this, Trump gave a speech last night at the National Republican, I think it's Congressional Committee or Campaign Committee dinner, but I think it's Congressional Committee, the NRCC. And let's just go to this for just a second. And he's not talking about this subject in particular, but
it's going to be something. And I'm actually looking forward to the midterms. I really are. We're going to prove that all of their treasonous years of betrayal will not be forgotten, because it's treason. What they did is treason. When they allowed millions of people to pour in through open borders from all over the world, they came. To me, that's treason. What they've done to our country is unthinkable.
Pretty clear right there. And when he says, or when the White House says that the United States must come before personal and partisan agendas, and the United States was clearly not put before personal and partisan agendas, that starts sounding a whole lot like treason. President, especially when you're violating people's First Amendment rights and stealing elections. President Trump already revoked the security clearances held by intelligence officials who falsely claimed Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. On day one, he signed an executive order to restore freedom of speech, dismantling federal programs that censor dissenting voices under the guise of combating misinformation, ensuring government serves the people, not partisan narratives. That same day, he signed an executive order ending the weaponization of the federal government. These decisive actions, so says the White House, underscore President Trump's pledge to ensure a transparent government that is loyal and accountable to the people. And that is all we can ask for out of government, and maybe something that we will get someday. One would hope that we have to. It is crazy what's become of this country. Let me have a look here at the chat, and then we will keep on going. All right. It's amazing. We haven't even gotten to the craziness of today, but we're going to get there. We are going to get there. We're almost there. In fact, you know what? Let's just skip. We're going to skip right there. And we're going to take a little break for a fun video. This is by the Dilly meme team. And it plays on the movie Fight Club. It even uses like an AI characterization of Edward Norton in his role as one half of the Tyler Durden character in Fight Club. Spoiler alert. And what a great job they've done with this little piece of content. And, you know, you can refer to this as propaganda. It kind of is in a sense, but it's fun propaganda. Can't be mad at it. Here we go. Oh, no, that's not it at all. Here we are. And it's a few minutes long, like 3 minutes.
Tell a story about one of the greatest psyops in history. The psyop that you deserve less and less every year, and that you should work harder and harder for less and less. The psyop that to be broke was the American way. The psyop that you should be lucky to pay your bills. The psyop that it's normal for prices to go up every year, forever. The psyop that it's normal to pay taxes. When you're born, death and taxes are the only certainty they would tell you. The psyop that you need to make $80,000 a year to take care of your family, then $100,000, and then $150,000. Now they tell you both you and your wife need to work to achieve financial freedom. So you hire the nannies, you hired the babysitters, you leave your community, you just don't have time for them anymore. Because you and your wife embarked on individual careers, these careers that took you away from your kids, your spouse, your home, your community, and they told you this was normal. It's totally normal to spend 2/3 of your time away from your family. It's normal to fight and get divorced, and it has nothing to do with the economic decisions and policies made by the government. None of it was normal. It was all nefarious, and it chipped away at what it meant to be an American. It chipped away at your self-esteem. It chipped away at your marriage, at your family, until you looked up and one day no one was married anymore. No one was succeeding unless they were heavily leveraged. One day you woke up and realized you don't recognize the world around you. Until Trump. President Trump came along and said, "This is your country, and that's your money." And he wouldn't back down. All the people that were destroying you came out and spoke against him. They went to great lengths to undermine his agenda. When President Trump hit his stride in 2019, they released a biological weapon that was the largest psyop in global history. COVID. They ran the scamdemic. They extorted trillions of dollars out of your economy. Then they stole your election overtly, hijacked your democracy, put up barbed wire fencing around your capital, and told you it was normal. During the next 4 years, they would unleash an invasion the likes of which no nation had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of illegals poured in the United States of America and began gobbling up whatever remaining resources were in existence. You were deemed a domestic terrorist by those in power. They surveilled your phones, your computers. They surveilled your lives. But it wasn't enough to stop Donald Trump. When they couldn't undermine his campaign through the courts and lawfare, they eventually tried to kill him again and again and again, until that fateful day in November when President Trump and America reclaimed their sovereignty. With him, he brought the richest man on the planet, for free, named Elon Musk. They then began uncovering and publicizing all of fraud, theft, waste, and abuse of the American taxpayer. They have threatened him. They have threatened his family. Subversion is all they have left. Infiltration is all they have left. Their funding is drying up. This is your Liberation Day.
Dilly Meme Team absolutely crushing it. That was, I think that's so much fun. Those guys were also just fantastic during the whole Ron DeSantis op. And I have to love them for that. I'm just dropping the link to this very post in the chats on both Substack and on Rumble, because I see people wanting that video. And I think that this is the easiest way to do that. Here we are. Yes, on Telegram in the info stream. If you're not on Telegram, get on Telegram. If you're not following the info stream, follow the info stream. That's where the majority of what I put out throughout the day in terms of links, stuff I'm following, thoughts, that's where the majority of it goes. So make use of it or don't. Let's go to billionaire. We're going to get into the financial stuff, obviously. And that's what that video was addressing, and did a great job of it. I think they nailed it. But I want to start the discussion about the tariffs and the economic fluctuations with billionaire hedge fund investor of Bridgewater, Ray Dalio, in a post he made on X, formerly Twitter, titled, "Don't make the mistake of thinking that what's now happening is mostly about tariffs." He writes, "At this moment, a huge amount of attention is being justifiably paid to the announced tariffs and their very big impacts on markets and economies, while very little attention is being paid to the circumstances that caused them and the biggest disruptions that are likely still ahead. Don't get me wrong, while these tariff announcements are very important developments, and we all know that President Trump caused them, most people are losing sight of the underlying circumstances that got him elected president and brought these tariffs about. They are also mostly overlooking the vastly more important forces that are driving just about everything, including the tariffs. The far bigger, more important thing to keep in mind is that we are seeing a classic breakdown of the major monetary, political, and geopolitical orders. The sort of breakdown occurs only about once in a lifetime, but they have happened many times in history when similar unsustainable conditions were in place." And so immediately, it sounds like he's talking about, you could even say he's announcing the Great Reset. Like, hey, here it is. This is what we were talking about the whole time. Sounds very much like the fourth turning. It happens cyclically throughout history. It generally happens once in a lifetime. And the fourth turning idea happens every 75 or 80 years. And I've talked before about this on the podcast, though probably only once. I think it's a really interesting period of time to understand that these cycles come back around. And of course, everything is cycles, because what we have is the infiltration, the destabilization, and then the advantage taking that goes on until the people have had enough. And there is then some sort of revolutionary moment. And then in the fallout, more infiltration, more subversion. They make use of that destabilization, seize more power, put more of their system in place, getting everyone to go along with that just to ease their suffering. And the cycle repeats. And so we are at the end of one of those cycles and things are being reset. So here are his examples. He says more specifically, number one, the monetary and economic order is breaking down because there is too much existing debt. The rates of adding to it are too fast, and existing capital markets and economies are supported by this unsustainably large debt. The debt is unsustainable because of the large imbalance between A, debtor borrowers who are too much in debt and are taking on too much debt because they are hooked on debt to finance their excesses, for instance, the United States, and lender creditors like China, who already hold too much of the debt and are hooked on selling their goods to the borrower debtors like the United States to sustain their economies. So you have this symbiotic relationship that will inevitably lead toward this downfall. And of course, the other thing to note that is not his primary concern is that that situation was put in place for a reason by the people running these things. There are big pressures for these imbalances to be corrected one way or another, and doing so will change the monetary order in major ways. For example, it is obviously incongruous to have both large trade imbalances and large capital imbalances in a deglobalizing world in which the major players can't trust that the other major players won't cut them off from the items they need, which is an American worry, or pay them the money they are owed, which is a Chinese worry. And I would say that Ray Dalio is operating in the paradigm we are shifting away from, because in the paradigm we are shifting toward, Donald Trump and Xi Jinping and those sovereign leaders and people who align with that program have already embraced the emergence of the multipolar world order. And Donald Trump, America first, understanding that America has, what's the right way to say it, asymmetric power advantages, is still going to steer things toward America being the dominant nation. But that's going to be within the multipolar world order, not within the centralized top-down control system that is the regime's one world liberal international rules-based order. Continuing, this is a result of these parties being in a type of war in which self-sufficiency is of paramount importance. Anyone who has studied history knows that such risks, under such circumstances, have repeatedly led to the same sorts of problems we're seeing now. So the old monetary economic order in which countries like China manufacture inexpensively, sell to Americans, and acquire American debt assets, and Americans borrow money from countries like China to make those purchases and build up huge debt liabilities, will have to change. Well, yeah, because that's obviously a scam. These obviously unsustainable circumstances are made even more so by the fact that they have led to American manufacturing deteriorating. Again, a planned result of the regime system, which both hollows out middle-class jobs in the U.S. and requires America to import needed items from a country that is increasingly seen as an enemy. And I think he means seen. In an era of deglobalization, these big trade and capital imbalances, which reflect trade and capital interconnectedness, will have to shrink one way or another. Also, it should be obvious that the U.S. government debt level and the rate at which the government debt is being added to is unsustainable. You can find my analysis of this in my new book, How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle, Self-Promotion. And it's funny, Bill Ackman has been posting nonstop over the last few days. We covered one of his posts the other day. I think we're going to cover another one today, but it's funny. He has like companies he's involved with as advertisements and examples of why the tariffs are going to be bad. Clearly, the monetary order will have to change in big disruptive ways to reduce all these imbalances and excesses. And we are in the early part of the process of it changing. There are huge capital market implications to this that have huge economic implications, which I will delve into at another time. Let's continue. The domestic political order is breaking down due to huge gaps in people's education levels, opportunity levels, productivity levels, income and wealth levels, and values. Again, a planned occurrence. And because of the ineffectiveness of the existing political order to fix things. And again, a planned occurrence because of the ways they have manipulated the Constitution. And, I talk pretty casually at this point about going back to the original Constitution, which means getting rid of all this that people believe is the constitutional system they're accustomed to, and maybe going back further than the Constitution. And I'm doing that because I want our country, if we are still going to have a country and still have a government, I want it to bear some correspondence to what many of the founders were concerned about in the founding era and were then overridden, not only when the Constitution's ratification was forced through, but then in everything that has been done to degrade the Constitution over time. That is not the same attack, if it is an attack at all, on the Constitution that is being made by the great resetters who are saying this system is inadequate to deal with these problems that they themselves are causing and that their actions have caused. It's not the same thing at all to say that the Constitution, the founders' vision, etc., is not sufficient to operate a country. Okay. So people can see what I'm doing or interpret what I'm doing as somehow attacking the Constitution. I think that's the furthest thing from the truth. This sort of approach would be a direct attack on the Constitution. These conditions are manifest in win-at-all-costs fights between populists of the right and populists of the left over which side will have the power and control to run things. No, it's not. It is a fight between populists on the right with the global regime and this top-down centralized system of authority and control. And it's possible that populists of the left will eventually join in that cause. And it's also possible that people who were never populists and who may not be populists now might join that cause over time, as they have over the last 10 years during and throughout the Trump moment, because they understand that's actually the way forward. And the government that they thought they had that was responsive to the people and a product of elections needs to be the way forward. Okay. So it really is just a push against the control, the top-down centralized control of the elites, of the global regime, of the uniparty in America. And Dalio is acting as though the real battle is elsewhere. It's not elsewhere. He says this is leading to democracies breaking down because democracies require compromise and adherence to the rule of law. And history has shown that both break down at times like those we are in now. That's because adherence to the rule of law has already been destroyed and dismantled over 250 years of the constitutional degradation that has produced the abomination we live under now. Okay. It requires compromise. Well, there is no compromise in a situation where the elections are fake. And Dalio and people like Dalio, who is himself a global elite who cares about protecting our democracy, are totally oblivious to all of this, operating in that past paradigm. History also shows that strong autocratic leaders emerge as classic democracy and classic rule of law are removed as barriers to autocratic leadership. Nonsense. Obviously, the current unstable political situation will be affected by the other four forces I'm referring to here. The problems in the stock market and economy will likely create political and geopolitical problems. For example, the international geopolitical world order is breaking down. That's number 3. Because the era of one dominant power, the US, that dictates the order that other countries follow is over. The multilateral cooperative world order under the US led is being replaced by a unilateral power rules approach. In this new order, the US is still the largest power in the world and is shifting to a unilateral America first approach. We are now seeing that manifest in the US-led trade war, geopolitical war, technology war, and in some cases, military wars. And again, I would say Ray Dalio has no idea what he's talking about. The US is the strongest country. So in a multipolar world order where every country is taking a themselves first approach, the US is still going to be the dominant, powerful country. There will be other dominant, or not dominant in relative to the US, but relative to their regions, powerful countries with spheres of influence, direct influence, and countries that they will then look after. And the world order is changing, okay? And I can't even tell you that it's changing necessarily in a good way. But the whole purpose is to understand the change and then figure out where we can gain power in that situation as the people, looking out for the interests of the people rather than the interests of the one world rules-based international order, the global regime and its fiat bankers and the elites that control systems. Moving on, number 4, acts of nature, droughts, floods, and pandemics are increasingly disruptive. Give me a break. This is essentially making Klaus Schwab's polycrisis case, okay? Ray Dalio is pleading ignorance here, perhaps. Pandemics caused by the regime, okay? These are regime disruptions. He might as well have listed climate change, although it's too hard to be taken seriously that way now. Number 5, amazing changes in technology, such as AI, will be highly impactful to all aspects of life, including the money, debt, economic order, the political order, the international order, by affecting interactions between countries economically and militarily, and the costs of acts of nature. Changes in these forces and how they're affecting each other is what we should be focusing on. He's talking about the Great Reset from the perspective of the Great Resetters. For that reason, I urge you not to let news grabbing, dramatic changes like the tariffs draw your attention away from these 5 big forces and their interrelationships, which are the real drivers of overall big cycle changes. If you allow yourself to be distracted by them, you will miss A, how the conditions and the dynamics of these big forces are causing these news-making changes, and B, you will fail to think through how these news-making changes will affect these big forces. C, you will fail to keep focused on how this overall big cycle and the parts that drive it typically transpire, which will tell you a lot about what is likely to happen. I also urge you to think about the interrelationships that are critically important. For example, think about how Donald Trump's actions on tariffs will affect the monetary markets, the monetary system, I guess he means, and the market, the economic order, it will be disruptive to it. And 2, the domestic political order. It will likely be disruptive to it, as it will probably undermine his support. No, it won't. And that's yet another thing that these people are just too ignorant about. And in that, you can detect what the hope is. The hope is to cleave MAGA off, and Republicans generally off, from their support of Donald Trump, recognizing that the instability that's happening around the world, but particularly here, It's going to be noise in our ear, right? It's going to be delivered by the media, an attack on our senses. And all of that will be meant to cause anxiety and worry and stress, understanding the instability of the world. And when we respond to that, we will want what seems to be the stable hand. And they have these narratives set up so that the stable hand is presented by the people who have run these things before. Is that where people will go? Will they believe that the regime has the stable hand and we want to give control back to them because Trump's just taking us through these changes and it's causing too much havoc? I believe the answer is no. And I think we can see the answer forming as no. And I think that Ray Dalio is operating in that past paradigm and is missing all of the signal that's right in his face. Number 3, he says that the international geopolitical order will be disrupted in many obvious ways that are financial, economic, political, and geopolitical. These are all the results of Donald Trump's actions. The climate, it will somewhat undermine the world's ability to deal with the climate change issue effectively. Okay, buddy. And 5, the technology development. It will be disruptive in some positive ways to the U.S., like bringing more technology production into the U.S., and in some harmful ways, like being disruptive to the capital markets that are needed to support technology development, and in too many other ways to enumerate here. And he goes on. I'm gonna actually let's close it out. I mean, I think that this really just is so revealing of what the global elite are thinking throughout this process. While the world is seeming totally unstable, the global elite are attempting to frame this to present themselves as the stable hands. Give them back control. These are the people who ran the pandemic. These are the people who ran the climate change. These are the people who've run the markets and the market manipulation. These are the people whose censorship has benefited. These are the people who overthrow governments. And we're supposed to be put off by the instability and give them back the control. We're all supposed to understand that the experts, the academics, the adults in the room, the people who lead the corporations, the people who provide the jobs, we got to turn back to them. As you do this, it is helpful to keep in mind that what is happening now is just a contemporary version of what has happened innumerable times through history. I urge you to study the actions that policymakers took in analogous past cases in which they found themselves in similar positions to help you build a list of things they might do. Things like suspending debt service payments to enemy countries, establishing capital controls to prevent the free flow of capital out of the country, and imposing special taxes. Many of these things would have been unimaginable not long ago. So we should also study how these policies work, the breakdowns in the monetary, political, and geopolitical orders that take the forms of depressions, civil wars, and world wars that then lead to the new monetary, political order and political orders that govern interactions with countries, and the geopolitical orders that govern interactions between countries until they break down. Have all happened repeatedly and are the most important things to understand well. And again, he wants you to assume the expert view. The winners of history presenting these sides of history have gotten it right. And because they were right then, they'll be right in the future. And so you should align yourselves with the regime and these trusted hands, these adults in the room, who will then successfully lead you through this great reset to the other side where they are still in control and you understand throughout the entire time that they're in control. He advertises his book again, and he continues advertising his book. So we will leave it there for Ray Dalio. But man, what a clear and coherent message from a regime elite to lay out what the Great Reset is all about. and how they anticipate this thing going. And when he starts talking about the breakdown of societies and the civil wars, you really have to wonder what it is they've got planned. And, you know, we could hear about all these things in the narrative, and we need to understand that they exist in the narrative. All right. You don't want to shoot your next door neighbors. Okay. Maybe in 2020, 2021, people thought there was a chance for a civil war. And we've all realized that's actually not what's going on now. Okay. I don't like the fact that communists are still brainwashed and that they're violent and attacking Tesla dealerships, and that now the protest movement, they're being shown that there is a real quote unquote resistance, and they can go back and join up, and then we'll get the racial stuff and we'll get the rest of it. Okay. But that doesn't mean that your neighbors are about to start shooting at you, and therefore you should start shooting at them first. Civil wars aren't like that. Civil wars are the regime militarizing whatever aspects of power they have within a country, and then bringing in foreign military and foreign slaves to force the people to submit, to subdue the people that were operating in an anti-regime fashion. That's what they've done throughout history, and they've done it here. They did it here in the Civil War, okay? You could make the argument they did it in Germany and throughout Europe during World War II. And I don't want to think that terrible things like that are going to happen. But the way to prevent those terrible things happening is to understand what the other side of the history Dalio is pitching actually meant, rather than just those are the worst people throughout history, Nazis and slave owners. Okay. That's what it was. World War II, Nazis, Civil War, slave owners. You cannot even suspect that the regime history is not correct. If you start to doubt that history that we've been told, that we've been indoctrinated with, it's wrong on every other issue. But when it comes to Civil War and World War II, well, there's no way it's wrong. And you can't say it's wrong, or else you're one of the bad guys. It is through understanding the other sides of those history, that of those histories, I should say, that we can prevent those histories from happening again, because they're running the same program. They're telling you they're running the same program. The way to prevent that program from having the same effect and them successfully making Trump Hitler, making us Nazis, making it so that all the things that the regime was famous for doing, the Nazi regime, the communist regimes in Russia and China, etc., successfully against the people who oppose the regime, will not work this time. And it's happening all around the world, and it has to work all around the world. Okay. And that, again, is why the narrative aspects are so important. The Great Reset train is still powering ahead down the tracks, barreling down the tracks through that canyon. We got the horse gangs on each side. The Western movie, have that in your mind. Black hats, white hats, whatever. Riding down each side. You got the great resetters like Ray Dalio, the global elite, the global regime, the people who want that top-down, centralized system of control, the one world, liberal, international, rules-based order. The tech libertarians might not want things arranged the same way, but they know that they're aligned enough. They'll want their view to win out, and maybe they'll fight it out somewhere down the line, but probably not. They'll probably all just be happy being rich as long as they're allowed to do whatever they want to do, and that'll be fine. Or the narrative and the process in general can be seized and redirected, and the people will not go along with the aspects of their program, and instead will go along with the hijacking of that great reset being performed right now by Donald Trump. I'm fully convinced that is what's happening. I should say there's some doubt. Okay. It's always possible that's not what's happening. And we're just all being dog walked into the worst dystopia that anybody could ever imagine. But I don't think that's happening. And I don't think that's happening because Trump is breaking apart all of these elements of their system of control. And it's not just to be replaced with a different system of control. It's to be replaced with nothing, which is what we want. Removing the system of control, allowing a free people to be free and prosperous. All right, let's get into some of the other aspects of it. This was Donald Trump this morning, and we'll start here because this was kind of hilarious. Truth Social. Be cool. Everything is going to work out well. The USA will be bigger and better than ever before. Cool. That is cool. We can be cool about that. And, oh man, this video is so bad. How can it be this bad? Sorry. I'm about to play this. Oh, this is horrendous. This YouTube is such low-grade resolution that it's almost unwatchable. So let me find another version of it here because I can't be showing you that. Oh gosh, it's all like that. Hold for processing. I'm trying to find the right moment. All right. Hold on. I'm almost there. All right. Let's go to Jules in Pulp Fiction. One of the greatest movies of all time.
$1,500. Okay, put it in your pocket. It's yours. Now, with the rest of those wallets in the register, that makes this a pretty successful little score, huh?
Jules, you give that fucking Nimrod $1,500 and I'll shoot him on general principle.
No, Yolanda, he ain't gonna do a goddamn motherfucking thing. Bitch, shut the fuck up! Yeah. Come on, Yolanda, stay with me, baby.
Now, I ain't giving it to him, Vincent. I'm buying something for my money.
Sorry, by the way, earmuffs.
Want to know what I'm buying, Ringo?
What?
Your life. I'm giving you that money so I don't have to kill your ass. You read the Bible, Ringo?
Oh, man. I picked up in the wrong side of this monologue. Oh, here it is. Okay, it's a little earlier. Here we are.
Like.
Come on, Yolanda, what's Fonzie like?
Cool.
What?
Cool.
Correcto mundo. And that's what we're gonna be. We're gonna be cool. Now, Ringo.
I'll leave it there. Man, the clip I had, you watch it on your phone, it looks fine. You put it on a bigger screen and it all falls apart. So my apologies. So Trump asks us to be cool. Now, this opening statement from Jamieson Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador Jamieson Greer, appeared in a congressional hearing yesterday, and I believe today as well. And this clip is a few minutes long. I think it's like 5 minutes long. It is absolutely worth watching all of.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee, thank you for taking the time today for this hearing. Chairman Smith, I appreciate your opening statement and the details of some of the effects that prior trade policy has had in your district. And Mr. Neal, I appreciate the work we've done in the past and your willingness to continue working with us. Last Wednesday, President Trump declared a national emergency in response to the large and persistent trade deficit that has built up in recent years. This deficit is driven in part by non-reciprocal tariffs, trading barriers, and other economic policies pursued by our foreign trading partners. President Trump imposed tariffs to address this emergency. These measures are aimed squarely at achieving reciprocity and reducing our massive trade deficit. This national emergency declaration and tariff action is the most significant change in U.S. trade policy since we allowed China, unfortunately, to join the World Trade Organization. The American working class, in particular, has suffered concentrated losses from the so-called China shock and other adverse effects of past trade policy, and the conditions that give rise to our massive trade deficit. The United States has lost 5 million manufacturing jobs and 90,000 factories since 1994. President Biden left us with a $1.2 trillion trade deficit in goods, the largest of any country in the history of the world. The United States share of world manufacturing output declined from 28% in 2001 to 17% last year. In the fourth quarter of 2024, U.S. manufacturing as a share of gross domestic product was the lowest it had been in 20 years. During COVID, we were unable to procure semiconductors to build our cars or materials for pharmaceuticals and personal protective equipment. During World War II, we built nearly 9,000 ships. Last year, the United States built only 3 ocean-going vessels. Our agricultural trade balance, which historically resulted in trade surpluses for our farmers, was in deficit the last 2 years of the Biden administration and likely will take some time to recover. These are all serious indicators of an economic and national security emergency. One important driver of these negative trends has been unfair, unbalanced, and non-reciprocal trade. This includes the effect of higher tariffs imposed by other countries on the United States, the effect of non-tariff measures that promote other countries' exports and obstruct U.S. exports, and other foreign economic policies favoring overproduction and degrading America's manufacturing capacity. This lack of reciprocity is an important driver of our global trade deficit and with particular countries. For example, the European Union can sell us all the shellfish they want, but the EU bans shellfish from 48 states. The result is a huge trade deficit in shellfish with the EU. We charge only a 2.5% tariff on ethanol, but Brazil charges us an 18% tariff. The result is we have a huge trade deficit in ethanol with Brazil. Our average tariff on agricultural goods is 5%, but India's average tariff is 39%. You get the picture. Our trade deficit, driven by these non-reciprocal conditions, is a manifestation of the loss of the nation's ability to make, to grow, and to build. And it's dangerous. And the president recognizes the urgency of the moment. On the very first day of his second term, President Trump issued a comprehensive memorandum setting out his trade policy direction. And over the past 10 weeks, he has executed on nearly all of these priorities. He has tightened tariffs on steel and aluminum, imposed new measures on auto and auto parts not made in the United States by American workers. On April 2nd, he declared his national emergency and imposed the reciprocal tariffs. The president's strategy is already bearing fruit. Over the past few weeks, a planned layoff for an auto production shift in Tennessee has been suspended, and that shift continues to operate. Another automaker is hiring additional employees and expanding overtime to increase auto production in the United States. Companies have announced $4 trillion in new investment in the United States. Nearly 50 countries have approached me to discuss the president's new trade policy and explore how to achieve reciprocity. Several of these countries, such as Argentina, Vietnam, and Israel, have suggested they will reduce their tariffs and non-tariff barriers. These obviously are welcome moves. Our large and persistent trade deficit has been over 30 years in the making, and it will not be resolved overnight, but all of this is certainly in the right direction. We must move away from an economy based solely on the financial sector and government spending, and we must become an economy based on producing real goods and services by American workers in our communities here. This adjustment may be challenging at times. This is a moment of drastic and overdue change, but I'm confident that the American people will rise to the occasion as they've done before. I trust them. I trust that they can do this. I appreciate this committee's interest in President Trump's trade agenda, though we may not agree on everything and may have some severe disagreements at times. It's my hope that our shared interest in doing what's right for the country will allow us to collaborate in the coming weeks and months. Thank you again for your time, and I look forward to our conversation.
Now, I mean, that guy is as good as it gets. That's just very clear, very compelling. It's fantastic that Donald Trump has put people like this around him. He's made the argument as well as it can be made. I mean, I think that's absolutely incredible. And also worth noting, I think that Scott Bessent has done a fantastic job. I want to share a really interesting post yesterday from a man named Lawrence Lepard. He's an investor, a financial writer, etc. And so he's actually quote tweeting here, but let's first read this tweet he's responding to. It's suitable politic. I don't know anything about this particular poster. He says Besant was hired to strengthen the dollar by doing the opposite of all the warning signs he saw in the British pound. Inflated housing markets, treasury yields, etc., all pointed to the big short that the Soros fund pulled off. Besant's obsession with the prices of homes and the interest rates on treasury bonds isn't just rank populism. He's looking to strengthen the leading indicators of a currency. This is what I mean by white hat hacking the dollar, mapping out its vulnerabilities to protect it against future exploitation. One of the most glaring vulnerabilities was a heavily overinflated trading market. Wall Street was on a sugar high. Hedge funds were leveraged to the gills, and if that bubble popped, it would have created an 2008-style financial crisis. The tariff rollout, volatility and all, there we go, was a way of creating controlled detonation. And we've been talking about controlled demolition for 5 years. Wall Street freaked out and deleveraged themselves. Now there won't be any banks or hedge funds who can't afford to pay off their loans because they overlevered. The extreme tariffs are also coming at a time when Besant sees a recession or depression happening in China. He emphasized this several times with Tucker. By boxing in China and shutting down their exports, he's creating the same conditions that led to the big short of the British pound. If the Chinese yuan collapses, then it'll cause a global flight into U.S. Treasury bonds, driving down interest rates even further for when they go to refinance the $9 trillion of expiring debt. And so all that is very interesting. And it occurs to me that I should probably spend more time figuring out which of these regimes in these countries around the world have their currencies in a situation similar to ours relative to the regime fiat banking system. But let's go to Leopard. I don't know. Lawrence Leopard. Sounds like Tony the Tiger's friend. Very interesting theory, he says in response. The extreme tariffs are also coming at a time when Besant sees a recession or depression happening in China. And he requotes some of what Suitable Politics says, and maybe that's just all of it, talking about the yuan collapsing. And so Besant, the former Soros guy, seems like he might be out Sorosing Soros, because George Soros was famous for destroying the British pound and profiting off the manipulation and destruction of these currencies. In fact, that famous George Soros YouTube 60 Minutes video has him talking about exactly that. Let me see if I can find that. If that comes up, I might be able to transcript our way right to the critical moment here. Talking about crashing the currencies. Here we are. This will actually work. Okay. Hold for processing. We're almost there.
Knowing. Soros makes huge bets on whole countries and economies. Last year, when he saw cracks in the Asia boom, he began selling the currency in Thailand. Traders in Hong Kong followed suit, triggering a financial crisis that plunged much of Asia into a depression.
In the last 2 years, you've been blamed for financial collapse of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and Russia.
All of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Are you that powerful?
No, I think there's a great misunderstanding.
The Prime Minister of Malaysia said that the region spent 40 years trying to build up its economy, and along comes a moron like Soros with a lot of money, and it's all over. He called you a criminal.
It's easier for him to blame an outside force than to admit that they were mismanaging their economy and their currency. The French finance minister talked about hanging speculation.
By the way, when he says mismanage their economy and their currency, he means that they weren't aligned properly with the global regime's agenda.
It is from lampposts.
Soros says the Asian currencies would have collapsed even if he hadn't been in the market. They were overvalued. He says people tend to follow his lead because he's been so successful.
I think that I've been blamed for everything. I am basically there to make money. I cannot and do not look at the social consequences of what I do. This man is.
And it goes on. And of course, he does look at the political and social consequences of what he does. That's one of the major parts of what Soros does, is influences political and social environments in these countries whose currencies he's destroying. It's incredible. It really is incredible. That was, dropping the link in chats on Substack and Rumble, by the way. But that was 1998, 27 years ago. And it's as relevant now as ever. And so Scott Bessent was in that Soros financial orbit. And it sounds like he is Sorosing George Soros. He's reversing and inverting these processes on the global regime, understanding what it is they do and making sure that we are defended from that, and maybe in some sense anti-fragile. And, you know, that's the Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He coined that term anti-fragility to describe when something, the phenomenon of something being attacked and growing stronger. Okay. And so maybe Scott Bessent is making the US dollar anti-fragile to the exact attacks predicted and expected and planned by people like George Soros or people like Ray Dalio, people who are the great resetters. Is Scott Bessent unresetting us? And if that's how it goes, gotta hand it to the man. I mean, he seems like a brilliant guy. You know, it's impossible to know. Is he on a good side or on a bad side? Because sooner or later, there's just the fog of war, and there's just that interference. You can't know. It's all of it is so confusing, but seems like he's headed in the right direction. Trump seems to like him. He seems to be providing stability throughout this process. Here he is. I think maybe this morning. Today was such a long day of news. It feels like it was days ago that I watched this, but
for the last 4 decades, basically since I began my career in Wall Street has grown wealthier than ever before, and it can continue to grow and do well. But for the next 4 years, the Trump agenda is focused on Main Street. It's Main Street's turn. It's Main Street's turn to hire workers. It's Main Street's turn to drive investment. And it's Main Street's turn to restore the American dream. For the last...
I mean, he's clearly not, as described in that post we just read a couple of minutes ago, a rank populist. He clearly cannot be that. Again, Scott Bessent was on the board of directors for the International Crisis Group, okay, a global think tank that runs these processes. Was he just undercover the whole time? I mean, I'm honestly very impressed. I really am. And if you're a fan of the show, you will know that that so very rarely happens. Here is one more from Bessent. Actually, I guess this was just a longer version. Sorry, I put down the longer version of the same clip. We can skip that. This was Bessent 6 days ago or 7 days ago. Sorry, this was 1 week ago with Brett Baer over on Fox News.
President in the Rose Garden. Let's get reaction to the president's tariff plan and progress of his big, beautiful bill going forward. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent joins us now. Thank you for being here.
Right, good to see you.
It was a big day. The president calls it Liberation Day. You know, we showed the markets before, but if you saw the post market reaction. It was kind of down across the board. People are looking at their 401ks and they worry about it. What do you say to them tonight?
Brett, I say that what we are doing is we're setting the stage for long-term economic growth, that we were on our way to a financial crisis. I used to teach a history of financial crises, and with that gigantic government spending, it was unsustainable. You look back in 1998, you look back in 2007, right before it looked great, everything collapsed. So, it looked great right before everything collapsed. So we have taken us off that trajectory, and we are putting ourselves back onto a sound trajectory.
You said 10% over 10 years would be $2.5 trillion coming in. You look at this list of all these countries, and there's some policy decisions here. China is at 34%, added to the 20% already. So that's 54% on Chinese goods.
Yep.
Are they going to come back with something big?
Well, we'll see what they do. Is my advice to every country right now is do not retaliate. Sit back. Take it in. Let's see how it goes, because if you retaliate, there will be escalation. If you don't retaliate, this is the high watermark.
So also not in the list, Russia, Belarus, but Ukraine is on the list. Mexico, Canada, not on the list, other than the fentanyl tariffs already there. There's a decision making here.
Well, Russia and Belarus, we don't trade.
So right from the get-go, on Liberation Day, Scott Besson is saying, don't retaliate. Don't retaliate. There's going to be a deal. Don't retaliate. And we talked the other day about good twin, evil twin, and the use of China as the avatar for the evil twin worldwide. Okay. I'm not saying that China has no relation to the issue. There's certainly a relation to the issue that exists in China. The evil twin faction in China has been very powerful and very much under control through the Chinese Communist Party for a very long time, although I don't think right now. Okay. That said, no matter how much the Uniparty has control in the United States, and this is the best parallel, right? Chinese Communist Party, one-party state, total regime influence. American Uniparty, one-party state, total regime influence, okay? So they can have all sorts of power, and there can still be a pushback against them, right? It's the global regime as it exists here, the global regime as it exists in China. What is the global regime when it comes to trade? A top-down centralized system of control, all right? So we have a top-down centralized system of control in China operating on behalf of the global regime, controlling currency, controlling trade, controlling the tariffs with other countries, etc. They have their system with all these other countries. Trump applies all these tariffs. That's going to break down the top-down centralized system of control. And it brings everything to a one-to-one relationship rather than multilateral and in fullness, the entire world multilateral system, which is just that top-down centralized control. Now it's bilateral, okay? One-to-one country. So if China is the avatar and China has to retaliate, the avatar has to retaliate because good twin faction in China is already on board with the program. They're already well into the process of decoupling. This is something that's been happening for years, but the evil twin faction resists it. And that is the avatar of China. So if you are refusing to retaliate in the interest of making good deals for your country, then you are accepting the new paradigm of the one-to-one trade relationship, the bilateral trade relationship with the United States. Okay? If you're doing that, then you are not aligned with the top-down centralized system of control, the global regime system, through the avatar of the evil twin faction in China. Are you aligning with China? Are you going to make China your trade partner, China the avatar, or are you going to engage in the bilateral relationship suggested by the multipolar world order and by countries looking out for their own best interests first? And I think that that's what all this is really about, okay? There are only two choices. Trade with the U.S. or trade with, quote unquote, China as the avatar for the global regime system. That's how it's going to be described from the American perspective. China is the embodiment of all of the enemy. And I think that that's what we're watching. And I think that that's the important distinction here. If you retaliate, you have chosen a side. It's not about getting the best deal for your country or even for your bloc like the European Union, who has decided to retaliate. It's about signifying you're on that side. Therefore, you are the enemy in the trade war. And so let's, with that in mind, I hope that made sense. With that in mind, let's continue here. So this is, actually, you know what? Maybe we should go to, where's Trump's post? I wanted Trump's post first. Actually, I'm editing the order of things on the fly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold off on this Scott Bessent for just a little bit, because I want to go through some of the other threats, I guess you could say, that were mixed up in this package. This is Bessent from on Fox Business talking about the situation vis-a-vis China.
That the Chinese actually don't want to come and negotiate because they are the worst offenders in the international trading system. They have the most imbalanced economy in the history of the modern world. And I can tell you that this escalation is a loser for them, that they have some very smart, the economists, the academicians, technocrats within their bureaucracy, and they would be telling the leadership that we do not have the edge here. They are the surplus country, that their exports to the U.S. are 5 times our exports to China. So they can raise their tariffs, but so what? Well, yeah, I think it's unfortunate.
They can raise their tariffs, but so what? Retaliate or don't retaliate. The amount of retaliation is not relevant. The effectiveness of their retaliation is not going to make Trump stop. The thing is happening. It's going to happen. And the delisting of Chinese stocks, that would be a big one. Here's Donald Trump last night talking about China, the tariffs, and then what he says about some of the Republicans at the speech, I think is so interesting. And I know that we're jumping around a little bit, but I think that the whole picture will form.
Biden couldn't do that. He couldn't name any. Name one country. Name any country. What's the name of our country? He doesn't know. That's why additional tariffs on Chinese goods are in place effective midnight tonight at 104%. Until they make a deal with us, that's what it's going to be. I think they'll make a deal at some point. China will. They want to make a deal. They really do. They want to make a deal. They just don't know how to get it started because they're proud people. China will now pay a big number to our treasury. This is all taxes. And don't let them keep telling you that this is a tax on our people. I hate that. They say it's a tax. No, often much of it is paid. And hey, look what happened during my first term. We had no inflation, and yet I took in hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs and taxes from China. No other president got 10 cents in tariffs or taxes from China. I got hundreds of billions of dollars. And I still got along with them because they understood what they were doing was wrong. They understood it. It's when you explain it, they say, I've had numerous leaders tell me, you're right, sir. I was waiting for you to bring this up. Because some of the trade deals that were made by predecessors as president were so bad, you almost wonder who did these deals. They were either crooked or stupid. They could be nothing else. They were either stupid or crooked. It's terrible, but it's all being changed. I changed a lot of it in the first 4 years, but it's all being changed. In the first 4 years, we had the most successful country in history in terms of economics. We had an 88% increase in the stock markets. We had an 88% increase. There's never been any president that had an 88% increase. We had 88% And there are a lot of happy people. And I think we're going to do much better than that this time, because this time I'm doing what I want to do with respect to the tariffs. I think we're going to do much better. And just remember the numbers. When you get up to $2 billion a day, $2 billion a day, they're saying, sir, can't be that, can it? I said, yeah, it can. It's the biggest transaction ever made. This is bigger than any deal. You guys, some of you work for companies. Your companies are peanuts. I don't care how big they are. Compared, this is the largest transaction in the history of our country. And don't let some of these politicians go around saying, because I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up, kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal. Please, please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything. I'll do anything, sir. And then I'll see some rebel Republican, some guy that wants to grandstand, say, I think that Congress should take over negotiations. Let me tell you, you don't negotiate like I negotiate. Congress takes over negotiating. Sell America fast, because you're going to go busted. You don't. I just saw it today. A couple of your congressmen said, I think we should get involved in the negotiation of the tariffs. Oh, that's what I need. I need some guy telling me how to negotiate. I tell you, the happiest people in the world would be China. They wouldn't be paying 104%.
And I think that he's talking about Thomas Massey there. Someone can correct me if you've seen more, but I think that Massey was the one trying to say that Congress should be out in front doing all that. And hey, maybe under proper order of things, okay, but why would anyone want those people to be handling anything at this point? This is Trump today on Truth Social, after we went through one of those cycles of the sky is falling in the morning. Everything's crashing. Oh, it's just crashing so hard. And he comes out in the early afternoon and he says on Truth Social, based on the lack of respect that China has shown to the world's markets, I am hereby raising the tariff charged to China by the United States of America to 125%, effective immediately. At some point, hopefully in the near future, China will realize that the days of ripping off the USA and other countries is no longer sustainable or acceptable. Conversely, and based on the fact that more than 75 countries have called representatives of the United States, including the Departments of Commerce, Treasury, and the U.S., I think that's trade representative, to negotiate a solution to the subjects being discussed relative to trade barriers, tariffs, currency manipulation, and non-monetary tariffs, that these countries have not, at my strong suggestion, retaliated in any way, shape, or form against the United States, I have authorized a 90-day pause and substantially lowered reciprocal tariffs during this period of 10%, also effective immediately. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So we talked about how Bill Ackman was calling for the 90-day pause. Some of the normie sphere took this as Trump blinking. He was upset because everything was going so bad in the markets and he just couldn't take it anymore. So he blinked. That doesn't sound like that's what this is at all. And also worth noting, Jameson Greer, in that talk we just went through a few minutes ago, talks about the non-monetary tariffs. Part of what he talked about was that deals were set up between nations that would make it prohibitive for the United States to be able to sell competitively in those markets. So it's not just that our goods were kept out due to the tariffs being charged. There were other manipulations from that top-down control mechanism, making it impossible for the United States to sell goods abroad, which I thought was super interesting. At this moment, that is when everything switched around and we went back to all green everywhere once again. It was all about do not tariff and you will get the good deals. This was Scott Bessent out there shortly after.
Good, thank you. And we saw the successful negotiating strategy that President Trump implemented a week ago today. It has brought more than 75 countries forward to negotiate. It took great courage for him to stay the course until this moment. And what we have ended up with here, as I told everyone a week ago, they're in this very spot, do not retaliate and you will be rewarded. So every country in the world who wants to come and negotiate, we are willing to hear you. We're going to go down to a 10% baseline tariff for them, and China will be raised to 125 due to their insistence on escalation.
All you have to do is not retaliate, which means you're with the program, then you'll be fine. The White House this afternoon tweeted from the official White House account, do not retaliate and you will be rewarded. Seems like that's what's going on. This was Howard Lutnick today. He posted Trump's Truth Social post that we just went through. He said, Scott Besson and I sat with the president while he wrote one of the most extraordinary truth posts of his presidency. The world is ready to work with President Trump to fix global trade, and China has chosen the opposite direction. Is it China, or is it the global evil twin and China just being used as an avatar? And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do want to drop it in. This is Bloomberg today. Amazon cancels some inventory orders from China after tariffs. And that would be really interesting if we stop seeing goods imported from China, from other countries around the world via Amazon and Walmart, because those are the corporations that have benefited so much from the trade imbalances, from our production and our manufacturing being moved to China. And we also have pharma tariffs coming in soon. And if pharma manufacturing comes back, that'll be another big deal. Gosh, man. I mean, these are the things, voting aside, because voting and elections are fake. This is what we quote unquote voted for. Let's go back to a little more from Scott Bessent.
And all this was, again, this was driven by the president's strategy. He and I had a long talk on Sunday, and this was his strategy all along. And that, you might even say that he goaded China into a bad position. They responded. They have shown themselves to the world to be the bad actors, and we are willing to cooperate with our allies and with our trading partners who did not retaliate. It wasn't a hard message. Don't retaliate. Things will turn out well.
They've shown themselves to the world as the bad actors. Is China the only bad actor that has shown itself for who it actually is, what its priorities actually are? I would say the answer is a very resounding no. We've seen the response from the European Commission and Ursula von der Leyen. We've seen the response from global elites, from corporate elites, from hedge fund elites, etc., from political elites who aligned themselves with Donald Trump, only to later move off in their own direction after having ridden the Trump train and gotten everything they could from that. A lot of people that are on that side of the agenda, they're with the enemy when it comes to the only choice that matters, have shown themselves and what their agendas actually are. And that includes the mainstream media that has sold nothing but panic all week to the markets. Donald Trump said, don't be a panicking and be cool. And the markets have responded. In fact, I haven't looked since before I got on. And of course, things are closed today, but after hours stuff, I mean, I can't wait to see what it looks like tomorrow. Who knows? I mean, let's be realistic here. Trump could pull other rugs at any point, including on the 90-day pause. Tomorrow, he might turn around and say, you know what? We reconsidered the 90-day pause. We need the tariffs to go into place right now and just cause the market to go down again. And this recalls that article from over the weekend in the Financial Times, where that author, Quinn Slobodian, I think was his name, he talks about how if the president can wake up and at his own whim, change global markets, that's a display of power. And it is a display of power. And he can go back and forth as much as he wants. There's a video that made the rounds today of a congressman having an absolute meltdown today over what he calls market manipulation. And this is just narrative manipulation. He's not manipulating the markets. The markets are responding to narrative manipulation on their own or through their own manipulation to try to win those narratives, and it's failing. So all of the control mechanisms are breaking down because Trump and his team know the control mechanisms and know how to counter them and are countering them effectively. And the thing that makes it effective is Trump's obvious and overwhelming mandate. And the fact that the people are on his side and the country by and large is willing to let him do these things and will stick behind him and with him while he does them, which is again, another indirect proof of the obvious and overwhelming mandate, which is another proof that our elections are completely fake, completely rigged, and completely stolen. And if you can't embrace the new paradigm and think about things in this way, I would suggest you might get left behind. This is Trump crypto czar David Sachs today. They did everything they could to create a panic. They predicted a Black Monday that never came. They became jubilant over an intraday correction on Tuesday. They were rooting for Trump to fail, even if it meant the market and economy crashed. In fact, that was part of their method for causing Trump to fail. Fortunately, their hopes have been dashed. Trump has been vindicated. China is isolated, and the rest of the world is lining up to negotiate new trade deals. Do you think this would have happened if Trump had asked nicely? Maybe if he had said, pretty please? Never. This was the only way to rewrite the rules of global trade. Once again, Trump was right about everything. Howard Lutnick joined in the celebration today with this very happy post on X, formerly Twitter, saying, President Trump is standing firm against our global trade imbalances. We will sign the greatest deals in history. And that's a grinning Lutnick with a grinning Trump with a Scott Bessent who is doing his version of grinning. And just a couple more quick ones, and then we will get out of here. Here is Donald Trump this afternoon outside the White House after doing a little event for an IndyCar team.
Because we have a big job to do. No other president would have done what I did. No other president. I know the presidents, they wouldn't have done it. And it had to be done. What was happening to us on trade, not only with, if you look at it, not only with China, but China was by far the biggest abuser in history, and others also, but somebody had to do it. They had to stop because it was not sustainable. Last year, China made $1 trillion off trade with the United States. That's not right. And now I've reversed it. It's for a short period of time, but we made $2 billion. We're making now $2 billion a day. And somebody had to do it. Roger actually said it. Charles Schwab was here a little while ago, one of the great financial people, and he said he's been waiting for 40 years for somebody to do what I did over the last month. And if you didn't do it, you wouldn't have a country. It wouldn't be sustainable. So I'm honored to have done it. And, look, nothing's over yet, but we have a tremendous amount of spirit from other countries, including China. China wants to.
No other Republican would have done it. And that honestly is the critical thing to understand. It's regime or against the regime, uniparty or against the uniparty. What other Republican is verifiably not an asset of the uniparty? Seems like there's only Trump. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm a little too pessimistic about that. Maybe we'll find out that there are others. But it seems like only Trump. And we will finish with this member of the uniparty, Chuck Schumer.
We know that Donald Trump doesn't think things through. We know that whatever hits him for the moment, he does. But on something so vital, like the whole economy of America, the amount of money people have in their pockets, in their livelihoods, on something as vital as this, yes, it leaves you agape at what he is doing and how much damage he is causing and how little he cares. He thinks it's a game. He almost thinks it's fun. Well, for 330 million Americans, this is not fun at all.
Speak for yourself, Chuck. I'm having a great time, and I would guess that all of you are too. All you got to do is not be a panicking, just be cool. And it'll all work out just fine. I will be back on Friday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden was never president.
Well,
what?
You know who I am, don't you?
Well, you ain't Fiona Apple, and if you ain't Fiona Apple, I don't give a rat's ass.
What's wrong with being an angry prophet denouncing the hypocrisies of our times? What do you think, Max?
Do you want to be an angry prophet denouncing the hypocrisies of our times?
Yeah, I think I'd like to be an angry prophet denouncing the hypocrisies of our times.
It's not true. It's more true than I would perhaps prefer.
Let you down.
We do a little trolling. It's called We Do a Little Trolling.
What? In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com, and for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.